Picture this. You're lying in bed, lights off, maybe a little too tired to watch anything but not quite tired enough to actually fall asleep. Your brain is still buzzing. You need something interesting. Something that pulls you in without demanding too much from you. Something that rewards you for just listening. Well, tonight you are in exactly the right place. Because we are diving deep into one of the most brilliantly written, shockingly creative, and genuinely underrated seasons of television ever made. Season 2 of The Boys. And whether you watched it when it first dropped or you've seen it a dozen times, I promise you there are things about this season that will genuinely surprise you. Details you probably missed. Behind-the-scenes stories that make the whole thing even more impressive. And facts that reveal just how much thought went into every single frame. So get comfortable. Settle in. And let's talk about The Boys Season 2 in a way you've never heard before. Let's start with the thing that makes Season 2 so remarkable compared to its predecessor. When Season 1 dropped, nobody really knew what to expect. The Boys arrived as this loud, irreverent, politically charged antidote to superhero fatigue, and audiences were genuinely shocked by how far it was willing to go. But here's the thing about shock value. It only works once. The second time around, you can't just do the same tricks. You have to evolve. And the creative team behind The Boys understood that completely. Season 2 wasn't just more of the same. It was a deliberate deepening of everything the show was trying to say. The satire got sharper. The characters got more complex. And the storytelling became genuinely layered in ways that rewarded close attention. One of the most fascinating aspects of Season 2 is how it handled the introduction of Stormfront. And let me tell you, the casting of Aya Cash in that role was one of the most inspired decisions the show ever made. Before The Boys, Aya Cash was perhaps best known for her comedic work, and that background turned out to be absolutely crucial to how the character worked. Stormfront is terrifying precisely because she's charming. She's funny. She's relatable. She speaks in this casual, internet-savvy language that makes her feel like someone you might actually follow on social media. And that is the point. The show was using her character to make a very specific and very pointed argument about how modern extremism operates. It doesn't announce itself with a red flag and a manifesto. It comes wrapped in humor and charisma and relatability. The fact that Aya Cash could deliver that performance with such precision while also making it feel completely natural is genuinely extraordinary. Now here's something that might genuinely surprise you. The character of Stormfront in the original comic books is actually a male character. A fairly straightforward neo-Nazi villain without the kind of complexity or social commentary layered into the television version. The decision to reimagine that character as a woman, and specifically to frame her as this social media savvy, image-conscious, deeply manipulative figure, was a creative choice made specifically for the show. And it transformed what could have been a one-note antagonist into something that actually says something real about the world we live in. The showrunners were looking at the rise of online radicalization and the way that certain ideological movements had learned to rebrand themselves using the aesthetics of progressivism and internet culture. Stormfront is the fictional embodiment of that very real phenomenon. Let's talk about Karl Urban for a moment, because Billy Butcher is one of the great performances currently on television, and Season 2 really pushed that character into new territory. What a lot of people don't know is that Karl Urban brings a lot of himself to that role. The physicality, the accent, the sheer intensity of how he inhabits Butcher. There's a rawness to it that doesn't feel entirely performed. Urban has talked about finding the character's anger very accessible because the things Butcher is angry about, the abuse of power, the corruption of institutions, the way ordinary people get ground up by systems designed to protect the powerful, those are things that genuinely resonate with him. Season 2 in particular gave Urban some of the most emotionally demanding material of his entire career, particularly in the scenes involving Butcher's wife Becca and his complicated relationship with her son Ryan. Watching Butcher navigate that relationship is watching a man who has built his entire identity around hatred suddenly confronted with the possibility that love might require something more from him. The character of Ryan, who is Homelander's biological son, is another element that Season 2 uses with remarkable intelligence. Because Ryan is not a villain. He is a child. A deeply confused, genuinely frightened child who has been raised in complete isolation by a mother who is trying to protect him from both Vought and from his own father. The show never lets you forget that. Even as Homelander becomes increasingly unhinged and the threat he represents becomes more acute, Ryan remains this figure of pure innocence caught in the middle. And the way Season 2 explores the idea that children can be either the best or worst thing that happens to someone like Homelander, that his son could either redeem him or destroy whatever was left of his humanity, is genuinely sophisticated storytelling. Speaking of Homelander, Anthony Starr's performance in Season 2 is something that genuinely deserves to be studied. There is a scene in the season where Homelander is alone, standing on a rooftop, and he begins laughing and crying simultaneously in this way that is profoundly disturbing. It communicates everything you need to know about where this character is psychologically without a single word of dialogue. Anthony Starr has spoken about the research he did for the role, looking at how narcissistic personality disorder manifests, how people who have never developed a secure sense of identity behave when that identity is threatened. Season 2 is really where that research pays off most visibly, because the threat to Homelander's identity in this season isn't external. It's internal. He is forced to confront the fact that he might not actually be the good guy he has always needed to believe he was. Now let's talk about something that comes up a lot when people discuss The Boys, and that is the show's relationship to real superhero franchises. The satire is obviously pointed at the MCU and DCU in general terms, but Season 2 gets quite specific. The idea of superheroes being used to justify military intervention, the manipulation of public perception around supers being deployed overseas, the congressional hearings about superhero accountability, all of this is clearly in conversation with real debates that were happening in American political culture at the time. And the show doesn't pretend to be neutral about any of it. The Boys has a point of view, and Season 2 sharpens that point of view considerably. The superheroes in this show are not metaphors for something vague. They are very specific metaphors for corporate power, for the military-industrial complex, for media manipulation, and for the way celebrity culture insulates the powerful from accountability. Here's a fascinating production detail that most viewers have no idea about. The show films primarily in Toronto, Canada, not in the United States. And yet it needs to convincingly depict New York City, various American small towns, government buildings, and corporate headquarters. The production design team on The Boys is working at an extraordinarily high level to make Toronto stand in for all of these locations, and Season 2 in particular required some incredibly creative problem-solving to pull off certain key sequences. The city of Toronto and its surrounding areas have a remarkable flexibility as a filming location, but matching the specific visual language of New York requires a level of attention to detail that the show's crew has become almost legendary for delivering. Let's shift to talking about Deep, because the arc that Chase Crawford is given in Season 2 is one of the most underrated storytelling choices the entire show has made. Deep was introduced in Season 1 as a fairly simple villain, a harasser who uses his position of power to exploit women and faces no consequences. Season 2 recontextualizes that character in a genuinely unexpected way. It doesn't excuse what he did, not even slightly, but it does explore the psychology of how someone ends up becoming that kind of person. The Church of the Collective subplot, which is clearly modeled on Scientology, is used to examine how predatory organizations exploit people who are already damaged, who are already desperate for belonging and validation. Deep is pathetic in Season 2, and that is precisely the point. The show is asking you to understand him without asking you to forgive him. The Gills scene. If you know, you know. And if you don't know, you're in for quite a surprise. There is a scene in Season 2 involving Deep's Gills that is among the most audacious, genuinely strange pieces of television I've ever encountered. It manages to be simultaneously absurd and emotionally sincere, which is a combination almost no other show has ever successfully achieved. What's remarkable about that scene is that it actually advances the character. It's not shock for shock's sake. The scene is about Deep confronting his own body, his own identity, his own sense of self-worth, through this deeply weird lens. The fact that the writers found a way to use something so bizarre to say something genuine about body image and self-acceptance is a testament to how carefully the show is actually constructed. Now let me tell you something about the writing process for Season 2 that really illuminates why the season feels so cohesive. The writer's room for The Boys operates somewhat differently from many other prestige television shows. Showrunner Eric Kripke, who also created Supernatural, has talked about the importance of having writers in the room who come from very different political and cultural backgrounds. The show doesn't want an echo chamber. It wants genuine debate about what the satire should be targeting, how far to push things, what actually constitutes meaningful commentary versus mere provocation. Season 2 in particular benefited from this approach because it was dealing with subject matter, the rise of white nationalist movements, online radicalization, media complicity and extremism, that required a nuanced and thoughtful approach to avoid either trivializing the issue or becoming preachy about it. Eric Kripke has been remarkably candid in interviews about the fact that the show often writes itself into positions that make him personally uncomfortable. Not because the content is gratuitous, but because the satire forces him to examine things he would rather not examine. The character of Homelander, for example, has become in some corners of the internet a figure of admiration rather than horror. Fans who identify with his worldview, who see his contempt for ordinary people and his rage at those who would constrain him as something aspirational. Kripke has said that this is simultaneously the most disturbing and the most validating response to the show, because it confirms that what they're depicting is real and present in the culture, not something they've invented. Let's talk about the finale of Season 2, because it contains one of the most memorable moments in the show's entire run. The scene where a character's head explodes. I'll try to keep this relatively spoiler-light for anyone who might somehow be hearing this before watching. But that moment is not just a shock gag. It is the culmination of an entire season's worth of thematic work about the limits of corruption, about what happens when systems designed to manage dangerous people fail, and about the way violence has a way of turning back on those who use it as a tool. The visual effects team on that sequence spent an enormous amount of time getting the practicalities right, but more importantly, the writers spent enormous care setting up the emotional and narrative logic that makes the moment land as more than just gross spectacle. Here is something that I find genuinely fascinating about Season 2 from a structural perspective. It is a season about exposure. Almost every major character arc in the season involves some version of a secret being threatened. Vaught's secrets about Compound v Homelander's secret about Becca and Ryan. Stormfront's secret history. The boys own secrets from each other. Even secondary characters like A-Train and Maeve are navigating questions about what happens when the lies they've been living start to unravel. The entire season operates around this central anxiety about revelation, about what it costs to keep things hidden and what it costs when they come to light. And this is not an accident. The theme is consistent from the first episode to the last, woven into every storyline simultaneously. Now here's a behind-the-scenes detail that really changed how I thought about the show. The costume design on The Boys is doing things that are easy to miss on a first watch. The soup costumes are designed to look like what a corporate marketing team would create if they were trying to sell heroism as a brand, not to evoke actual functionality or power. The textures, the colors, the little branding details. All of it is designed to read as product first and as superhero costume second. But in Season 2, there's a subtle evolution in some of the costumes that tracks character development. Starlight's costume in particular goes through changes that mirror her psychological journey through the season, her increasing resistance to Vaught's control, her reclamation of her own identity. These changes were entirely intentional. Elizabeth Shue joins the cast in Season 2 as Madeline Stillwell's replacement, and the character of Ashley brings something that the show really needed at that point in its run. A corporate villain who is just trying to survive, who isn't ideologically committed to anything beyond her own advancement, and who therefore represents the most common and perhaps most dangerous kind of complicity. Ashley isn't a true believer. She's just someone who has decided that the cost of resistance is too high. And watching her navigate the impossible demands of managing superheroes who could vaporize her with a look is both terrifying and darkly funny in exactly the right measure. Let me tell you about the music in Season 2, because this is another element that doesn't get nearly enough credit. The show's music supervisor has an almost supernatural ability to find needle-drop moments that recontextualize both the songs and the scenes they're placed in. There is a particular sequence in Season 2 set to a classic piece of music where the juxtaposition between the wholesome familiarity of the song and the absolute carnage unfolding on screen creates this vertiginous feeling that is entirely unique to the boys. The show understands that music is not just mood enhancement. It's commentary. The song choices in The Boys are always saying something about the scene they're soundtracking. Something that I want to highlight specifically for anyone who appreciates craft in storytelling is the way Season 2 handles the character of Mother's Milk. Laz Alonso gets some of the best material of his career in this season, and what makes it work is the tension between MM's desperate need for order and control, his meticulous, careful, methodical approach to everything, and the absolute chaos that defines his life as part of The Boys. Season 2 gives him a family subplot that grounds all of his psychological quirks in something emotionally real. His obsessive tendencies aren't played for comedy. They're shown as survival mechanisms developed by someone who has been unable to prevent terrible things from happening to people he loves. That's rich, careful character work. Now I want to spend some time on a detail that really reflects the show's commitment to internal consistency. The world of The Boys has its own internal logic around how powers work, how Compound V functions, and how the Vought Corporation has structured its entire operation around managing and monetizing these abilities. Season 2 expands this worldview significantly. The congressional hearings about soups, the revelation about Compound V being given to people in other countries, the corporate and political machinery around all of this. It's extraordinarily detailed world building that rewards attention. The show clearly has documents, timelines, and histories for this world that never make it onto screen but that inform every decision the writers make. Here's something that might make you appreciate the show on a different level. The Boys films its more extreme violence and its more provocative content with a deliberate aesthetic that is meant to be uncomfortable rather than exciting. This is an intentional choice. In most action movies and superhero films, violence is choreographed to be cool. The camera angles, the editing rhythms, the sound design all work together to make it feel thrilling. The Boys deliberately subverts this. When violence happens in The Boys, it usually looks wrong. The camera doesn't glorify it. The editing makes it feel sudden and unglamorous. The sound design emphasizes the wet, physical reality of what's happening. This is the show making an argument with its filmmaking language about how we've been trained to consume violence as entertainment. Let's talk about the ending of Season 2 and what it sets up. Without going into too much detail, the season ends with Homelander in a genuinely interesting place. He has not been defeated. In fact, in some ways he has consolidated power. But his psychology has shifted. He has been forced to confront his own vulnerabilities in ways that he has not fully processed. And the dynamic with Ryan represents both his greatest potential weakness and his most dangerous new motivation. Season 3 of The Boys picks up threads from everything Season 2 planted, but the seeds are all right there in the final episodes of the second season if you know what to look for. One thing that often gets overlooked in discussions of The Boys is the performance of Jack Quaid as Huey Campbell. Huey is the audience surrogate character, the everyman who serves as our entry point into this world of superpowered horror. But Jack Quaid finds unexpected depths in what could have been a purely functional role. In Season 2 particularly, Huey goes through a crisis of his own effectiveness. He starts to question whether he is actually useful to the boys or whether he's just tagging along. And the choices he makes as a result of that crisis, some of them very wrong choices, feel earned because of the groundwork Quaid has been laying since episode 1. There's a really interesting piece of trivia about the casting process for The Boys that relates to Season 2 specifically. When they were searching for the right person to play Stormfront, the casting team reportedly went through an extensive search looking for someone who could thread a very specific needle. The character needed to be immediately likable. She needed to have the kind of warmth and charisma that makes you want to trust her. But there also needed to be something just slightly off, just barely perceptible, that a careful viewer might catch on a rewatch. Aya Cash nailed this so completely that several people involved in production have said they occasionally had to remind themselves during filming that the character was the villain. Now here is a piece of context that I think is genuinely important for understanding Season 2 and why it landed the way it did. The season was released in 2020, during an extraordinarily turbulent period in American and global history. The conversations the show was having about extremism, about institutional corruption, about the relationship between media and truth, these were not abstract conversations. They were conversations that were happening in real time, right alongside the show. And the creative team has talked about the strange and sometimes uncomfortable experience of watching their satire feel less like exaggeration and more like documentary as the year unfolded. That context of release doesn't just make the show feel prescient. It helps explain why it resonated so deeply with so many viewers. Let me tell you about the practical effects work in Season 2, because this show uses more practical effects than most people realize. The production takes a hybrid approach, combining CGI with practical elements in ways that keep things grounded. The gore, for instance, is frequently practical. The decision to use real practical effects for many of the show's more extreme physical moments is part of what gives the violence its particular quality of wrongness, that feeling that what you're seeing couldn't quite have been manufactured. There's a texture to practical effects that CGI still struggles to replicate perfectly, and the production designer and special effects coordinator on The Boys have been quite deliberate about preserving that texture. Something worth discussing is how Season 2 handles the representation of trauma, particularly among its female characters. Season 1 was criticized in some quarters for how it depicted sexual violence, with some arguing that it was too explicit, that it was using assault as a plot device rather than engaging meaningfully with its consequences. Season 2 responds to that criticism in interesting ways. The show is more thoughtful about giving its female characters agency in how they process and respond to what has been done to them. Maeve's arc in particular, her refusal to be used as a tool anymore regardless of the personal cost, feels like the show working through and deepening its approach to these themes. The show also does something really interesting with A-Train in Season 2. A-Train is not a sympathetic character. He made a terrible choice in Season 1 and then made it worse with his subsequent choices. But Season 2 gives him a storyline that forces you to hold two things at once simultaneously: his villainy and his victimhood. Because A-Train is also someone who has been exploited, who has been built up and then discarded by Vought, who has had his identity and his community weaponized against him. The show doesn't use this to forgive him, but it does use it to make the world feel more textured and real, because in the real world, people are frequently both. Here's a final behind-the-scenes detail that I love. The script for the season finale was rewritten multiple times right up until filming began, and even after filming began, certain elements were adjusted based on what the cast was bringing to the material. The performers on this show, particularly Anthony Starr and Carl Urban, are doing things with their characters that consistently surprise the writers and push them to find new angles. Television at its best is a collaborative art form, and The Boys Season 2 is a really beautiful example of what happens when you put genuinely talented people in a room together and give them the freedom and the trust to follow the work wherever it leads. What makes The Boys Season 2 ultimately so enduring as a piece of television is that it takes its audience seriously. It doesn't talk down to you. It doesn't pretend the world is simpler than it is. It looks directly at some of the most complicated and uncomfortable aspects of contemporary culture: the way we manufacture heroes, the way we consume outrage, the way power insulates itself from consequence, and it finds a way to make all of that viscerally entertaining without blunting the critique. That combination is extraordinarily rare. Shows that are genuinely funny, genuinely scary, genuinely provocative, and genuinely thoughtful at the same time don't come along very often. And the fact that Season 2 managed to raise the bar set by an already excellent first season is the thing that really cements its legacy. It would have been so easy to simply do more of the same. More blood, more shock, more outrage. But instead, the show chose to do something harder and more interesting. It chose to grow, to complicate, to ask harder questions and resist easier answers. Season 2 is where The Boys became not just a great genre show, but an actually important piece of popular culture. Something that was genuinely in conversation with its moment in a way that very few things achieve. So the next time you're drifting off and you want something interesting to think about, something that rewards the way your brain works when it's just slightly untethered from the demands of full consciousness. Think about Stormfront and what she says about how modern extremism sells itself. Think about Homelander crying and laughing on that rooftop and what that tells you about the psychology of people who never learn to be accountable. Think about Butcher standing in the ruins of everything he thought he knew, looking at a little boy he didn't ask for, and choosing to be better than he has any natural inclination to be. The Boys Season 2 is not just great television. It's a mirror. And the thing about mirrors is they show you things you can't see any other way. Sleep well. And maybe when you wake up, watch it again. Picture this. You're lying in bed, the room is dark, and your mind just won't stop racing. You need something to pull your focus away from the noise of the day, but you don't want anything too intense, nothing that's going to spike your adrenaline or keep you wide awake. What you need is a calm, steady voice walking you through fascinating little details about a world you love. And if that world happens to be The Boys, one of the most creative, wildly imaginative television universes ever built, then you are in exactly the right place tonight. So go ahead and get comfortable. Pull that blanket up. Close your eyes if you want. We're just going to talk about this incredible show, the hidden layers underneath it, the fascinating connections, the little facts that make the whole thing feel even richer. There's no pressure here. Just settle in and let the words wash over you. The Boys as a television series didn't start from nowhere. It came from a comic book written by Garth Ennis, which was itself a pretty wild and darkly satirical take on what the world might look like if superheroes actually existed and were managed by a massive corporation. But when Eric Kripke adapted it for television, he brought something completely unique to it. Now here's what makes that interesting in a sleepy sort of way. Eric Kripke isn't just the showrunner of The Boys. He's also the creator of another enormously beloved television series called Supernatural, which ran for 15 full seasons and developed one of the most devoted fan followings in television history. So when you watch The Boys, you are watching something created by the same mind that built that entire other universe. Two very different worlds, same creative fingerprint running through both of them. And because of that connection, The Boys has quietly become something of a reunion place for actors who spent years working on Supernatural. Jensen Ackles, who plays the character Soldier Boy on The Boys, is probably the most famous example of this. He played one of the two lead characters on Supernatural for the entire run of the show. But he's not alone. Many of the actors and people involved in The Boys passed through Supernatural at some point along the way. This creates a kind of invisible thread that runs beneath the surface of The Boys, connecting it to all those years of supernatural storytelling. For fans who know both shows, watching The Boys sometimes feels like a homecoming in the most unexpected and wonderful way. Let's drift a little deeper into the world of Soldier Boy specifically, because his character is one of the most layered and quietly tragic figures in the entire show. On the surface, he comes across as a brutish relic from another era, a man out of time in the worst possible way, someone who holds on to outdated ideas and throws his weight around with zero self-awareness. But underneath that, there are these small, almost tender moments that keep slipping through. His relationship with Homelander, for instance, slowly develops into something that feels genuinely paternal, which is deeply ironic given how monstrous both of them can be. Watching two people who are essentially walking disasters find some kind of father and son connection is one of those things that only The Boys could pull off without it feeling absurd. Homelander himself is one of the most psychologically complex antagonists in recent television history. He built his entire identity around. So when that worship feels threatened, or when someone gets close enough to make him feel something real, he can't handle it. The vulnerability terrifies him, and so he destroys it. There's something almost unbearably human about that, even though he is clearly portrayed as a villain. The show never lets you forget that monsters are made, not born. Now let's think about the corporation at the center of everything, Vought International. The writers built Vought as a satire of corporate America in the most elaborate and detailed way. They have their own media empire, their own film studio, their own product lines, their own political connections. They've essentially made superheroes into a brand, and that brand is worth more to them than anything else, including the actual human beings involved. The dark satirical twist is that this doesn't feel that far from reality. The way celebrity is managed, the way public image is constructed and protected, the way corporations will sacrifice individuals to preserve their reputation. The Boys takes all of that and just turns the volume up to an almost unbearable degree. And yet somehow, the closer you look at it, the more familiar it starts to feel. One of the quieter and more interesting creative choices the show makes is how it handles its in-universe media. There are advertisements, movies, news broadcasts, social media posts, merchandise, all existing within the world of the show as if this is just the normal backdrop of life. The in-universe film called Dawn of the Seven, for example, is treated within the show as a massive blockbuster production, with all the behind-the-scenes drama and ego conflicts you would expect from a real Hollywood production. This layering of fictional media within the show's already fictional world creates a strange depth to everything. You start to understand how these characters are perceived by the ordinary public who can't see what we see as the audience. The gap between public image and private reality is one of the central tensions the show keeps returning to again and again. Let's talk about the character of Sage for a moment, because she is one of the most quietly unsettling people in the entire series. She is presented as the smartest person alive, someone whose intelligence is so vast that it becomes its own kind of curse. Her backstory involves a grandmother who loved her, a medical establishment that dismissed her, and a grief that eventually curdled into something deeply cold. She doesn't want power for the reasons most people want power. She doesn't want fame or control or adoration. What she actually wants is to be left alone. And she has come to believe that the only way the world will ever leave her alone is if it essentially tears itself apart. That is a specific kind of nihilism that the show presents not as cartoonish villainy but as something that grew organically from real pain. It's disturbing precisely because you can trace the emotional logic of it even if the conclusion is monstrous. The reference the show makes to a famous episode of The Twilight Zone is particularly rich for those who catch it. In that old black and white episode, a bookworm who just wants peace and quiet to read survives a nuclear apocalypse and finally has all the time in the world to read every book he's ever wanted. And then his glasses break. It's one of the most heartbreaking ironic endings in all of classic television. The connection to Sage's plan in The Boys is genuinely clever, because it raises the same question. Even if she gets what she wants, even if the world burns and she's left in silence, will it actually give her what she's looking for? Or will there be some equally devastating irony waiting for her at the end? Now let's drift towards something a little lighter. The comedy in The Boys is something that deserves its own moment of appreciation. The show is technically a dark superhero satire, but it operates with a very specific comedic sensibility that goes far beyond simple parody. There are jokes layered inside jokes, cultural references folded into absurdist situations, and a willingness to go to places that most television writers would never dare approach. What keeps it from feeling gratuitous is that the comedy usually serves a purpose. The most outrageous moments are often also the most pointed criticisms of something real. The grossness is frequently the point. When something makes you recoil and laugh at the same time, you're being forced to confront your own reaction, which is exactly what good satire should do. Terra, Butcher's dog, is one of those details that the show uses with surprising emotional depth. On the surface, a dog who behaves exactly the way Terra behaves is just pure comedy. But within the context of the show, the dog represents something about Butcher himself. Butcher is a man who has burned almost every meaningful human connection in his life. He is abrasive and ruthless and self-destructive in ways that push people away. But the dog stays. The dog doesn't care about any of that. And the scenes between Butcher and Terra carry this quiet emotional weight that sneaks up on you if you let it. The show uses that animal connection to remind you that even the most damaged people have some corner of themselves where something soft still lives. The relationship between Kimiko and Frenchie is another one of those emotional cores that the show returns to throughout its run. Kimiko doesn't speak in the traditional sense for much of the series, and yet her relationship with Frenchie is one of the most communicative and emotionally alive connections in the whole show. They understand each other without words in ways that the more verbally expressive characters never quite manage. There's a tenderness between them that exists in contrast to all the violence surrounding them. And the show is smart enough to complicate that tenderness too, to let it feel fragile and uncertain in the way real relationships do, rather than just presenting it as a safe harbor in a storm. Here's an interesting little detail about the world building that doesn't always get talked about. The show takes great care to establish its own internal history, its own mythology about how superheroes came to exist and how Vought built its empire around them. References to past decades, to earlier generations of heroes, to experiments and cover-ups and historical events that Vought quietly influenced. This isn't just window dressing. It creates a sense that the world of the boys has been going on long before we arrive to watch it, and will continue in some form after the story ends. That historical depth is part of what makes the fictional corporation feel so believably menacing. They didn't build this overnight. This is the result of decades of careful, deliberate manipulation. The character of Starlight, Annie January, sits at a very specific intersection that the show finds particularly interesting. She came into the Seven as someone who genuinely believed in the possibility of being a hero, of using extraordinary abilities to do actual good. She wasn't naive exactly, but she was idealistic in a way that the world of the show immediately began attacking from every direction. Watching her hold onto pieces of that idealism while also becoming something harder and more practical is one of the ongoing emotional journeys of the series. She represents the question of whether it's possible to maintain your values inside a corrupt system, or whether the system always wins eventually. Mother's Milk is one of those characters where the show does something genuinely thoughtful with motivation. His reasons for being in the fight against Vought are deeply personal, connected to family history and loss in ways that make his commitment feel grounded in something real rather than abstract heroism. And the show pays attention to how that personal history shapes the way he sees the larger mission. He's not fighting for some general idea of justice. He's fighting for something specific and human, which is ultimately what makes him one of the most relatable people in a cast of characters who are frequently operating at the extreme edges of human behavior. Think for a moment about how the show handles power specifically, physical superhuman power, and what it does to people psychologically. Almost every superhero in The Boys who has significant power has been damaged by it in some way. Either they were given it too young, or under circumstances that were traumatic, or in a context where the power was immediately used to corrupt rather than protect. The show seems to argue pretty consistently that power in the hands of people who haven't developed the emotional and moral framework to use it responsibly is one of the most dangerous things imaginable, which maps directly onto critiques of real-world power structures, even without the supernatural element. There's something deeply satisfying about how the show builds and releases tension across episodes. It doesn't follow a predictable rhythm. You can be deep in a comedic sequence and then suddenly something genuinely affecting happens. Or you can be braced for something terrible and the show pivots into absurdist humor instead. This unpredictability is part of what keeps people watching, but it also creates a specific emotional experience where you're never quite settled, never quite sure what register the show is operating in at any given moment. Which, when you think about it, is also what living inside a world with unchecked powerful people might actually feel like. The satirical targets of The Boys are broad in scope but consistent in their angle of attack. Corporate greed, celebrity worship, religious manipulation, political opportunism, media complicity. These aren't separate themes that the show visits occasionally. They're woven together into a single interconnected critique of how power operates in modern society. And the show does this without ever becoming preachy, which is genuinely difficult. The secret is that the satire is always expressed through character and situation rather than through direct statement. Nobody steps up to deliver a lecture. The critique lives in what happens, in the consequences characters face, in the gaps between what characters say and what they actually do. Let's close out this evening with the idea that makes The Boys perhaps most interesting as a thought experiment. The superheroes in this show are not heroes in any meaningful sense. They are celebrities who happen to have extraordinary abilities. The corporation treats them as products. The public treats them as gods. And many of them have come to believe the mythology built around them. The question the show quietly asks underneath all the chaos and violence and dark comedy is a simple one. What would it actually take to hold power accountable? And the answer the show keeps returning to is that it takes ordinary people refusing to stop, even when the cost is enormous, even when the odds are completely ridiculous, even when it seems like the forces aligned against them are simply too vast and too entrenched to ever be moved. That's not a comfortable answer. But it's an honest one. And on that note, you can let all of that settle gently into the back of your mind, into that place where the thoughts get quieter and the body gets heavier and the night wraps around you like something familiar and warm. There's nothing more to figure out tonight. The world of the boys will still be there tomorrow, full of its wild characters and impossible situations and hidden layers waiting to be noticed. But right now, this moment is just for resting. So breathe slowly, let the thoughts drift off one by one, and drift gently into sleep knowing you've spent these quiet minutes well. The most unsettling superhero ever put on screen wasn't created by Marvel or DC. He was raised in a laboratory, never told he was loved, and given the power to destroy everything he touched. The Boys is a show that exists in this fascinating space between satire and genuine emotional storytelling. It takes everything you thought you knew about superheroes and flips it completely upside down. The premise sounds simple on the surface. What if the people with extraordinary powers were not the noble protectors we always imagined them to be? What if instead, they were deeply flawed, psychologically damaged, and in some cases genuinely monstrous? What comes out of that question is one of the richest, most layered television universes ever constructed. Let's start with something that gets overlooked surprisingly often. The show draws heavily from a comic book series that came out in 2006. The original comics were written by Garth Ennis, who is known for being absolutely relentless when it comes to pushing boundaries. The television adaptation keeps the core spirit of that material alive, while also expanding and deepening certain storylines in ways that even fans of the comics found genuinely surprising. The showrunners made a deliberate choice early on to honor what made the source material so powerful, while also making it feel like something fresh and specifically designed for the world we live in right now. One of the most interesting things about the show's main villain, Homelander, is that his psychology is meticulously constructed. Every single thing about him, from his obsessive need for approval to his terrifying outbursts of violence, traces back to a very specific childhood that the show reveals gradually over multiple seasons. He was raised in a laboratory. He never had a parent in any meaningful sense. The people around him during his most formative years treated him as an asset rather than a child. That kind of deprivation creates something almost impossible to repair. The show takes that damage seriously, and what emerges is a character who simultaneously wants to be loved by absolutely everyone and also holds everyone in contempt. That contradiction is what makes him so fascinating to watch. The actor who plays Homelander has spoken in various interviews about how he approaches the role. And one thing that consistently comes up is the idea of playing someone who has no genuine emotional anchoring. Everything Homelander feels is exaggerated, performative, or completely disconnected from reality. When he smiles, it never quite reaches his eyes. When he laughs, there is something hollow underneath it. These are all deliberate choices, and they come through in a way that makes your skin crawl even during moments that should feel lighter. Now here is something truly interesting about the way the show handles its generational trauma theme, because this is one of the most carefully crafted threads running through the entire series. The show essentially argues that trauma does not just affect the person who experienced it. It gets passed down. It mutates. It becomes the lens through which damaged people see the world and eventually the template they use when interacting with others, especially the people closest to them. You see this most clearly in the relationships between fathers and sons. Each generation inherits something broken from the one before, and the tragedy is that even when characters are aware of this cycle, breaking it turns out to be extraordinarily difficult. Soldier Boy is a character who embodies this idea perfectly. He is presented as a kind of golden age hero, the original American superhero, a product of the post-World War II era when America was deeply anxious about its standing in the world and desperately wanted its own myths and legends. The show is very specific about how this character came to exist. After the war, there was this enormous appetite for symbols of American strength and superiority, and a character like Soldier Boy fit perfectly into that cultural moment. He was strong, conventionally handsome in that mid-century movie star way, and he projected an image of uncomplicated patriotic power. But behind that image was someone who carried their own wounds. The show makes clear that Soldier Boy himself had a brutal upbringing, complete with a father who was abusive and cruel. He learned what relationships looked like from someone who treated love as a weapon. And so when he eventually had a son of his own, which he did not even know about for most of his existence, he had no template for anything other than what he had been taught. The cycle continued. Homelander grew up without Soldier Boy, yes, but he still inherited that damage through other means, through the clinical coldness of the laboratory, through the manipulative warmth of people who only cared about controlling him. And then there is Ryan, Homelander's actual biological son, a young boy navigating an almost unimaginably complicated situation. He loves his father. Children often love their parents regardless of what those parents have done, because love and safety feel like the same thing when you are young. But Ryan is also perceptive enough to sense that something is deeply wrong. The show handles this character with real tenderness. He is not simply a prop in the larger story. He is a person trying to figure out who he is while surrounded by adults who all have their own agendas and their own damage. One of the most poignant things about Ryan's storyline in the later seasons is the moment when he discovers that things he believed to be true about his family were not true at all. When a child discovers that the story they were told about their own origins was a lie, something fundamental shifts inside them. The ground under their feet is no longer solid. This is something that real survivors of family dysfunction talk about all the time. The rewriting of your own history is sometimes more traumatic than the original wound, because it means you have to question not just what happened but what you understood about your own life. Now let's talk about the broader world of the show, because one of its most brilliant achievements is the way it constructs the infrastructure of this universe. Vought International is not just a company. It is a stand-in for every massive corporation that has ever wrapped itself in idealistic language while pursuing fundamentally self-interested goals. The show understands that the most dangerous villains are not the ones who openly announce their cruelty. The most dangerous villains are the ones who have convinced themselves and everyone around them that they are actually the good guys. The character of Stan Edgar is one of the show's most sophisticated creations for exactly this reason. He is not loud. He is not theatrical. He does not give monologues about domination or victory. He is simply a man who understands how power works at a structural level, and he uses that understanding with cold precision. When he says that corporations are the true villains, more dangerous than any individual with superpowers, he is not being ironic. He genuinely believes this because he has spent decades operating within that system and watching it produce results that individual violence never could. There is a speech in the later season that captures something genuinely important about how systems of power perpetuate themselves. The argument goes something like this. You can remove a person from power. You can expose them. You can even destroy them. But the structure that made them powerful, the institutions, the money, the cultural mythology built around their image, that structure persists. It finds a new vessel. It adapts. This is not a cynical or hopeless observation. It is actually a call to think about change at a deeper level, to address the roots rather than just the visible branches. The science fiction elements of the show, particularly the substance called Compound V, are used to explore questions about pharmaceutical power, about what happens when profit and human experimentation intersect without sufficient oversight. The show draws explicit parallels to real historical atrocities, moments when human beings were treated as experimental subjects by institutions that had convinced themselves the ends justified the means. These are not comfortable parallels, and they are not meant to be. Friedrich Vought, the fictional scientist whose legacy haunts the entire show, is clearly modeled on the very real phenomenon of Nazi scientists who were recruited by the United States government after World War II through a program historically known as Operation Paperclip. The show does not shy away from what this means. If the foundation of your entire superhero industry was built on atrocity, if the very substance that creates these powerful beings was developed through the torture and murder of innocent people, then everything built on top of that foundation carries that weight. Every superhero in the show, whether they know it or not, is connected to that original violence. One of the recurring visual and thematic motifs of the show is the contrast between what things look like on the surface and what they actually are underneath. The Seven, the show's central superhero team, exists primarily as a marketing product. Their public appearances are managed by publicists. Their relationships are manufactured for media consumption. Their personalities are packaged and sold. The show draws this out in a way that feels uncomfortably familiar given how celebrity culture actually functions in the real world. Starlight is interesting precisely because she starts out genuinely believing in the mission. She grew up with authentic faith in superheroes as symbols of hope and protection. When she discovers what the reality of being a corporate superhero actually looks like, the disillusionment she experiences is written all over her face in every scene. She does not immediately become cynical. She does not flip into pure pragmatism. She struggles. She tries to reconcile what she believed with what she is learning. That struggle is one of the most human things in the show. Huey, her partner, has his own version of this journey. He enters the story as someone who has experienced the direct violence of superhero recklessness, someone who lost someone he loved to a casual accident that a superhero did not even bother to pause for. His anger is righteous. His desire for accountability is completely understandable. But the show is also honest about how anger, even righteous anger, can become its own kind of trap if you are not careful with it. Huey spends much of the series learning to be dangerous without becoming what he hates. Butcher is probably the most complicated character in the show's ensemble. He has all the qualities that genre fiction likes to give its anti-heroes. He is ruthless and intelligent. He is capable of extraordinary violence when the situation demands it. He is also genuinely committed to a cause he believes in deeply. But the show refuses to let him be simply cool or simply tragic. It insists on showing you the actual cost of the choices he makes. When Butcher hurts someone, when he lies or manipulates or destroys something in the service of his mission, there are consequences that ripple outward. People suffer. Trust is broken. The people who believed in him have to decide what to do with that information. His relationship with Ryan is one of the most emotionally loaded in the entire series. On one level, Butcher sees Ryan as a threat, as a potential Homelander in the making, a child with devastating power and uncertain moral development. On another level, Ryan represents something Butcher has lost and can never recover. There is a complicated protective instinct that lives inside his hostility, and the show gives you enough glimpses of it to understand that even this most guarded and destructive character carries something tender underneath all the damage. The world building in the show extends into some genuinely fascinating territory when it explores the religious dimension of superhero worship. There is something the show keeps circling back to, which is the idea that in a world where people with godlike power actually exist and are publicly visible, the human impulse toward religious devotion does not disappear. It just finds a new object. Homelander understands this on some instinctive level, and in the later seasons he begins actively cultivating it. He does not just want to be admired. He wants to be worshipped. He wants the kind of unconditional devotion that does not ask questions, that does not require accountability, that simply surrenders. The show makes this critique of authoritarian movements very carefully and very specifically. The rallies, the iconography, the way dissent is treated as betrayal, the way followers are encouraged to define themselves entirely in opposition to imagined enemies. These are not abstract warnings. They are drawn from very specific historical and contemporary sources. The writers have been thoughtful about not making this a partisan thing in the simplest sense. The critique is broader than that. It is about how charismatic authority figures exploit the genuine human need for belonging and meaning. The Deep is one of the show's most unexpected emotional landscapes. He starts out as a figure of somewhat grotesque satire, a powerful figure who abuses his position and then faces consequences he considers unfair. But somewhere along the way, the show found something genuinely pathetic and almost sympathetic in him. He is someone who has never developed any meaningful inner life. He defines himself entirely through status and through what others think of him. When that external validation is taken away, there is nothing underneath. No actual self to fall back on. His relationship with aquatic life becomes the one place where he experiences something close to genuine feeling, and the show plays this for dark comedy while also letting it be genuinely sad. Mother's Milk is the character who perhaps best represents the show's argument about how ordinary people find the courage to resist systems that feel too large and too powerful to challenge. He is not someone who wants to be a hero. He has a family he loves. He has a normal life that he wants to return to. But he also has a history with Vought that made turning away impossible. His commitment is not abstract. It is not ideological in the airy sense. It is personal and specific and rooted in actual loss. That is what makes him believable as someone who keeps going even when the situation seems completely hopeless. Frenchie and Kimiko as a pair explore something the show does surprisingly tenderly, which is the question of what a meaningful life looks like for people who have been shaped by violence. Kimiko was turned into a weapon. She did not choose her power. She did not choose the world she was pulled into. What she wants, with a clarity that cuts right through all the chaos around her, is something quiet. She wants connection. She wants a future that belongs to her rather than to the emergency she was drafted into. Whether or not she gets that future is something the show holds in careful suspension. The spin-off elements that the show has begun to develop point toward an even more elaborate universe, one that stretches back through decades of American history. The idea of exploring the origins of Vought in the post-war period, of seeing how the superhero mythology was constructed from the ground up during the Cold War era of anxiety and ambition, is genuinely exciting from a storytelling perspective. The show has always been interested in history, in how the present is shaped by things that happened before any of the current characters were born. Expanding backward into that territory gives the mythology more texture and more weight. One of the most technically impressive things about the show is how it manages tonal shifts. In a single episode, you can move from something absolutely grotesque and shocking to something quietly heartbreaking to something genuinely funny and then back again. This should not work. Shows that try to cover that much tonal ground usually end up feeling incoherent or manipulative. But the writing and direction maintain such clear control of the emotional logic that each shift feels earned rather than jarring. You understand why this moment follows that moment even when the surface texture feels completely different. The music choices throughout the series deserve their own mention. There is a particular joy in how the show places classic rock and pop songs in completely unexpected contexts, letting the familiar sounds of beloved music become strange and sometimes sinister when attached to images that recontextualize them entirely. This is a technique with a long history in film and television, but the show uses it with particular wit and precision. As you drift towards sleep, carry with you the idea at the heart of all of this storytelling. Power does not corrupt in a simple mechanical way. What power does is reveal. It takes what is already inside a person and removes the normal social pressures that keep it hidden. The kindness that a genuinely kind person carries comes out more freely when they have power. The cruelty that a cruel person has been managing comes out too. The world the show builds is not a world where extraordinary people are simply bad. It is a world where extraordinary power applied to ordinary human damage produces consequences that ordinary human communities struggle to contain. The most hopeful thing about it is that even in that world, people keep trying. They keep reaching toward each other. They keep believing that something better is possible. And that, in the end, is worth dreaming about. The show that made superheroes terrifying is ending, and the secrets buried inside Season 5 are almost too wild to say out loud. The Boys has been building toward this moment for years. Season 5 was announced as the final season of the show, meaning everything the writers, producers, cast, and crew have been constructing since the very beginning was always pointing toward this conclusion. That weight is hard to overstate. When a show knows it is ending, the energy around it changes entirely. The desperation to tie things together properly, to honor what came before, to go out on a high note rather than fizzle away like so many shows before it. That pressure shapes every single decision made in the writing room, on set, and in the editing bay. And from everything that has come out about Season 5, that pressure was very much felt by everyone involved. Let us start with something that might surprise you if you have been following the show casually. The Boys is based on a comic book series written by Garth Ennis and illustrated by Derek Robertson. The comic ran from 2006 to 2012, and it was genuinely one of the most provocative, boundary-pushing pieces of comic book storytelling ever published. But here is the thing that makes the show fascinating from a creative standpoint. The television adaptation does not follow the comic closely. It uses the comic as a launching pad, a source of tone and certain characters and some plot threads, but the show has branched off dramatically in its own direction. This means that even readers of the original comics were watching Season 5 without knowing exactly how things would end. The show carved out its own mythology, its own version of these characters, and its own conclusion that does not simply mirror what the comics did. That creative independence is genuinely rare, and it is one of the reasons the show has felt so alive and unpredictable. Now, as you settle in a little deeper, let me tell you something about the production scale of Season 5 that is worth appreciating. The Boys is one of the most expensive television productions in Amazon Prime Video's history. The visual effects work alone is staggering. Every season has pushed the boundaries of what streaming television can accomplish visually, and Season 5 was described by those involved as the most ambitious in terms of scope and scale. The final season needed to deliver on years of storytelling, which meant the action sequences, the world-building moments, and the character payoffs all had to feel larger than anything that came before. That is a significant undertaking. The crew behind the scenes, the visual effects artists, the stunt coordinators, the costume designers, all of them were working toward creating something that would feel like a proper cinematic finale rather than just another television episode. One of the most interesting things about The Boys as a show is what it actually represents beneath all the violence and the satire. At its core, the show has always been a story about power. Specifically, about what happens when power goes completely unchecked. Homelander, the show's central villain played with absolutely terrifying commitment by Anthony Starr, is not just a bad superhero. He is a portrait of narcissism, trauma, and the catastrophic consequences of giving someone with unresolved psychological damage complete and unlimited power. Season 5 had to reckon with what that character arc ultimately meant. Where does someone like Homelander end up? What does the world look like if he wins? What does it look like if he loses? These are not simple questions, and the show has never offered simple answers. Anthony Starr's performance across the entire run of The Boys has been one of television's great acting achievements. The way he plays Homelander, with this terrifying combination of desperate neediness and volcanic rage, is genuinely unsettling. In interviews leading up to Season 5, Starr spoke about the emotional toll of inhabiting this character, about the difficulty of finding the final note for someone this complex. He wanted to make sure the ending felt honest to who Homelander had always been rather than convenient or tidy. That kind of investment from a lead actor in the final stretch of a show makes a real difference to the quality of the finished product. Let your mind wander a little here. Think about the world of The Boys for a moment. It is a world where superheroes are not government-operated. They are corporate products, managed, marketed, and monetized by a massive conglomerate called Vought International. The genius of this concept is how it mirrors real-world conversations about celebrity, corporate power, and the commodification of heroism. The show is not subtle about its satirical targets. It has taken aim at media companies, political movements, celebrity culture, and the ways in which the public can be manipulated through carefully crafted narratives. Season 5 pushed these themes further than any previous season, with the political landscape of the show's world mirroring real-world tensions in ways that made some viewers genuinely uncomfortable in the best possible way. Here is a fact that might keep your curiosity ticking just long enough before sleep takes over. The character of Starlight, played by Erin Moriarty, underwent one of the most significant character evolutions in the show's history. When we first met Annie January in Season 1, she was an idealistic young woman genuinely excited about becoming a superhero. By Season 5, she had been through experiences that would have broken most people. What the writers did with her journey was track how someone maintains their fundamental goodness under impossible pressure. Moriarty has spoken about how physically and emotionally demanding the later seasons were, and how the final season required her to dig into emotional territory she had never accessed in previous years. The relationship between Starlight and Butcher, these two people from completely different worlds who end up needing each other in unexpected ways, became one of the emotional cores of the finale. Speaking of Billy Butcher, Carl Urban's portrayal of this character has been another one of the show's great accomplishments. Butcher begins the show as something close to a straightforward anti-hero. A man with a mission, brutal methods, and a reason that feels somewhat sympathetic. But as the show progressed, the cracks in his character deepened, and the show began asking harder questions about whether Butcher was actually the good guy he believed himself to be. Season 5 had to answer those questions definitively. Urban has talked in interviews about how he wanted the final season to honor all the complexity that had been built into this character without giving him an easy redemption or an unearned fall. The nuance required for that kind of performance is considerable. Now let us drift into some behind-the-scenes territory that is genuinely fascinating. Eric Kripke, the showrunner of The Boys, is the creative force at the center of everything. He spent years working on the adaptation, developing it from a relatively straightforward pitch into something much more politically charged and thematically ambitious. Kripke has been very vocal about wanting the show to feel genuinely dangerous, to push into territory that makes audiences question their own assumptions. In the lead-up to Season 5, he described the writer's room process as the most intense of the entire series, with debates about where characters needed to end up that sometimes got genuinely heated. That collaborative tension is often what produces the most interesting creative outcomes. One of the things that makes The Boys unique in the television landscape is its willingness to destroy characters that audiences have invested in. The show has never been precious about its cast. Major characters have been killed off in shocking ways throughout the run, and Season 5 was not going to break that tradition. The unpredictability of the show is one of its greatest assets because it means viewers can never fully relax. Even in your most comfortable sleep-adjacent state, your brain is probably somewhere in the back registering the fact that nobody on this show is truly safe. That tension is deliberately maintained by the writers as a tool to keep audiences engaged and to give the story genuine stakes. Let me tell you something about the music of The Boys that does not get discussed enough. The show has always used music in a deeply intentional way. The soundtrack choices, often popular songs deployed in moments of extreme violence or emotional irony, are a signature element of the show's aesthetic language. The music department for Season 5 had a significant task in front of them. How do you choose songs for the final chapter that feel like a culmination of the show's musical identity while also serving the specific emotional needs of each scene? The team behind the music, working alongside the directors, spent considerable time making those decisions. The result is a final season where the music feels both familiar in its approach and fresh in its specific selections. There is something worth knowing about the physical production of The Boys that is easy to overlook when you are watching it from your couch or your bed. The show films primarily in Toronto, Canada, though it regularly creates the impression of being set across the United States and beyond. The production design team builds environments of extraordinary detail. The Vought Tower interiors, the suburban neighborhoods, the underground spaces where the boys operate, all of these are constructed with a level of care that makes them feel lived in rather than like television sets. That groundedness is part of what makes the fantastical elements of the show land so effectively. When something impossible happens in a space that feels completely real, the impact is significantly greater. As you let yourself sink a little deeper into that comfortable state between awake and asleep, here is something to turn over in your mind. The Boys, particularly in its final season, was dealing with questions about legacy. What does it mean to fight against something enormous and corrupt? Does it matter if you win or lose? Can one person or one small group actually change the systems that seem too large to touch? These are not questions unique to a fictional world. They resonate because they are questions people genuinely grapple with when they look at institutions and power structures that feel immovable. The show never pretends to have easy answers, and that intellectual honesty is part of what has made it matter to so many people. The relationship between The Boys and its audience is genuinely interesting from a sociological standpoint. The show has attracted a fan base that is extraordinarily passionate, but it has also attracted attention from people who perhaps missed some of the satire and interpreted certain characters as aspirational rather than cautionary. This is something Kripke and the cast have addressed publicly on multiple occasions, particularly around the character of Homelander. The writers had to be mindful in Season 5 of how they were closing out this character's story in a way that was unambiguous about the show's moral position without becoming preachy or simplistic. That is a genuinely difficult creative challenge, and how they navigated it is one of the more discussed aspects of the final season. Let your breathing slow down a little. Let the details of the day drift back. We are going to keep moving through these fascinating layers of a show that has meant a lot to a lot of people. The ensemble cast of The Boys is one of the best assembled groups in streaming television history. Beyond the leads, the supporting players have been essential to the show's texture. Characters like Frenchie, played by Toma Capone, and Kamiko, played by Karen Fukuhara, provided the show with emotional counterweights to some of its heavier material. Their relationship across the entire run became one of the most genuinely touching elements of a show that is not exactly known for being gentle. Season 5 had to find the right conclusion for them as well, and the care taken with their arc in the final season reflects how seriously the writers took every thread in this story. There is something worth mentioning about the guest cast and special appearances that Season 5 featured. One of the joys of a show like The Boys is the way it occasionally pulls in surprising names for limited appearances, often deploying them in ways that are simultaneously unexpected and completely logical given the show's satire-driven world. The final season used this approach strategically, bringing in faces that felt significant in the context of what the show was saying about celebrity and power rather than just as stunt casting for its own sake. Here is something genuinely fascinating about the writing process for Season 5. The writers' room for the final season reportedly knew from very early in the process which character deaths were coming, which relationships would resolve, and what the final image of the show would be. Working backward from a known ending is a different creative experience than building a season with the destination still uncertain. It allowed the writers to plant seeds and establish patterns that would pay off in specific ways, creating a season that felt architecturally coherent from beginning to end rather than making things up as they went. That structural intentionality is evident in retrospect when you look at how storylines that seemed disconnected early in the season ultimately converged. The visual language of Season 5 represented an evolution of the show's aesthetic approach. The directors brought in for the final season worked closely with cinematographer to develop a look that felt slightly different from previous years, signaling that this chapter was something distinct. There is a quality to the lighting choices and camera movement in the final season that feels heavier, more deliberate, as if the world itself knows that something conclusive is coming. These are the kinds of craft decisions that audiences often feel without being able to articulate why a scene hits differently than expected. Let us talk about something that has been a consistent strength of the show from the very beginning. The Boys has always done exceptional work with its female characters. In a genre that has historically not prioritized the depth and complexity of its women, The Boys gave its female characters genuine agency, genuine flaws, genuine contradictions. Queen Maeve, played by Dominique McElligott, had one of the show's most interesting arcs in earlier seasons. The show has not been content to let female characters exist primarily in relation to male ones. They have their own drives, their own histories, their own failures and triumphs. Season 5 continued this commitment to complexity, giving its women material that was as rich and challenging as anything given to the male leads. There is a fascinating parallel that runs through the final season between individual psychology and institutional corruption. The show has always understood that systems do not become corrupt on their own. They are corrupted by people, by specific choices made by specific individuals who have the power to do differently. Season 5 traced this connection with particular precision, showing how the personal wounds and unresolved traumas of specific characters rippled outward into consequences affecting millions of people in this fictional world. That psychological framework for understanding systemic problems is actually quite sophisticated and represents some of the show's best thematic work. As you let yourself get even more comfortable, think about this. The Boys managed something that very few shows in the superhero genre have achieved. It made you feel the weight of superpowers as something terrifying rather than aspirational. In most superhero stories, powers are gifts. Things to be celebrated and deployed heroically. The boys reframe them as something closer to a curse, or more accurately, as an amplification of whatever the person already was. Give someone with empathy and good judgment enormous power, and they might do genuinely good things. Give someone with unresolved trauma and narcissistic tendencies that same power, and you get Homelander. Season 5 pushed this idea to its logical conclusion, examining what it finally takes to address something that powerful and that dangerous when the normal mechanisms of accountability have completely broken down. The production crew behind the scenes in Season 5 reached numbers that rivaled major feature film productions. The coordination required to bring a season of this complexity to life involves hundreds of people across departments that audiences rarely think about. The props department alone had to manage an enormous inventory of items specific to this world. The art department had to maintain consistency across a fictional universe that has developed significant internal detail over 5 seasons. The wardrobe team had to manage character looks that had evolved across years while also introducing new visual elements appropriate for the final chapter. All of this invisible work accumulates into the experience of watching an episode and simply believing the world on screen. Here is something that sits at the interesting intersection of fiction and reality that The Boys has always played with. The show frequently references and parodies real-world media culture, political rhetoric, and corporate behavior in ways that are deliberately close to actual events. The writer's room reportedly has a practice of constantly monitoring real-world developments and asking how they can be incorporated or reflected in the story they are telling. This gives the show a quality of immediacy and relevance that many genre shows lack. By Season 5, the political landscape of both the show's world and the real world had become so intertwined that watching certain scenes felt startlingly pointed. Let your mind drift with this next one. There is a character in The Boys named Black Noir who has gone through one of the stranger and more interesting journeys in the show's history. The character's arc across the seasons, including revelations about their nature and identity, reflects the show's willingness to completely subvert audience expectations and then do something genuinely unexpected with the material that emerges from that subversion. Season 5 had to find a meaningful place for the legacy of this character within the larger resolution of the story. The Boys has been consistently praised by critics not just for its entertainment value but for what it represents as a piece of cultural commentary. Television critics who might otherwise be dismissive of superhero content have written seriously about what the show is doing and why it matters. This critical respect has shaped the show's production in interesting ways. When a creative team knows that thoughtful people are paying close attention to what they are saying and how they are saying it, there is an additional layer of accountability that influences decisions. The writers of Season 5 were very much aware that the ending of this show would be analyzed and discussed in depth, and that awareness shaped the ambition of what they attempted. Something worth knowing about the actors as a group is how much they genuinely seem to enjoy each other's company and how that chemistry translates to the screen. The ensemble energy of The Boys is not manufactured. The cast has spoken across many interviews about the friendships they have developed over the course of the show and about how working together on the final season carried a genuine emotional weight because they all knew it was coming to an end. That bittersweet awareness of finishing something meaningful permeates the performances in Season 5 in ways that are difficult to quantify but absolutely present. The humor of The Boys is one of its most discussed and most divisive elements. The show is genuinely funny, often in ways that are deeply uncomfortable. It uses comedy as a pressure release valve, deploying absurdist or darkly comic moments within sequences of extreme tension in order to manage audience experience in a specific way. Season 5 maintained this balancing act even as the stakes reached their highest point. The ability to be genuinely funny within a story that is also asking serious questions is one of the rarer creative skills, and the writers of The Boys have demonstrated it consistently. There is a quieter element of the show that sometimes gets overshadowed by the more explosive content. The Boys has always found time for small, intimate character moments that exist outside the main plot machinery. Conversations between characters about their fears, their regrets, their hopes for things they believe they do not deserve. These moments, often just two people talking in an unglamorous setting, are where the show does some of its most affecting work. Season 5 included a number of these quieter scenes that longtime fans have pointed to as among the most emotionally resonant in the entire series. Your breathing is probably slower now. Good. Keep going with me just a little longer because there is more worth knowing. The relationship between the boys and the superhero genre more broadly is worth reflecting on. The show arrived at a moment when superhero content was reaching a kind of saturation point in popular culture. Rather than adding to that saturation, it offered a fundamentally different perspective on the genre's assumptions and conventions. It asked what superheroes would actually look like if the world they operated in was recognizably like our own, with the same power dynamics, the same corruption, the same gap between stated values and actual behavior. Season 5 brought this interrogation of the genre to its most pointed and definitive expression. Garth Ennis, the creator of the original comic, has been publicly appreciative of what the television adaptation has done with his source material, even where it diverged significantly. This relationship between original creator and adaptation team is not always harmonious, and the fact that Ennis has expressed genuine enthusiasm for the show speaks to the respect with which the television creators approached the spirit of what he originally created even when they departed from a letter of it. Something to sleep on. The legacy of The Boys as a show will likely be discussed for many years. It arrived at a specific cultural moment and responded to it with genuine creative ambition and moral seriousness. The final season was the opportunity to cement that legacy or undermine it, and by most accounts from both critics and fans, what was delivered in Season 5 was worthy of everything that came before it. Whether you agree with its conclusions, whether you found its resolution satisfying or challenging, the show earned the conversation it prompted. The technical achievement of the visual effects in Season 5 deserves a final mention. The artists and technical teams who created the visual language of this world worked across the entire production timeline, from pre-production design through principal photography and into the long post-production period. Some of the more elaborate sequences in the final season involved effects work that was in development for over a year before the episodes aired. The invisible craft required to make the impossible look ordinary is something that audiences experience as effortless when it works properly, which means the people responsible for it only get noticed when something goes wrong. In Season 5, very little went wrong. The Boys gave us something rare in popular entertainment. A story with genuine moral stakes, characters who were allowed to be genuinely complicated, and a willingness to follow its own logic even when that meant going to uncomfortable places. Season 5 was the conclusion of that promise, the delivery of everything the show had been building toward across years and hundreds of thousands of words of storytelling. And that is a good thought to carry you gently toward sleep tonight. All those years of work, all those people, all those decisions made in rooms you will never see, by people whose names scroll past in credits that go by too fast to read. All of it adding up to something that you watched in the dark, that made you feel things, that gave you something to think about. The world of The Boys is a dark one. But the fact that stories like this get made and watched and talked about says something quietly hopeful about the people who make them and the people who love them. There is something human in wanting to look at power clearly, to refuse to dress it up in a cape and call it good, to insist on asking harder questions even when easier answers are available. So as your thoughts slow down and the details of this fictional world begin to blur at the edges and blend with whatever images your sleeping mind is starting to assemble, just know that you spent this time in good company. With a story that tried to be honest about difficult things. With characters who were messy and human even when they could fly or punch through walls. With a show that knew it was ending and tried to end with integrity. Let the sounds around you fade. Let the weight of everything you carry today get a little lighter. The Boys Season 5 has come and gone, and it left a mark. And now, it is time to rest. Sleep well. Let me tell you something that most people who claim to be die-hard fans of The Boys completely get wrong. They think they know everything about this show. They've seen every season, they've got the merch, they can quote every line. But I'm about to share things about The Boys that will genuinely make you question how well you actually know this universe. Stay with me because some of these are going to hit different than you expect. The Boys is one of those rare properties that exists on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, it looks like a superhero deconstruction story. But underneath that, there's a decades-long journey that started in a completely different medium, shaped by real-world frustrations, industry chaos, and creative decisions that nearly never happened. And the more you dig into that history, the more fascinating the whole thing becomes. So let's start from the very beginning, because even the origin of this story has a fact buried in it that most fans completely overlook. Garth Ennis, the writer behind The Boys, actually created the comic series back in 2006. But here's what a lot of people don't realize. The comic was originally published by DC Comics under their Wildstorm imprint. It wasn't an independent project from the start. DC actually dropped the series after just 6 issues because the content was considered too extreme even by their standards. Think about that for a second. A company that has published some of the most violent and disturbing comics in the mainstream market looked at The Boys and said, "You know what? This is actually too much." That is a statement in itself. After DC dropped it, the series was picked up by Dynamite Entertainment, where it ran for its full 60 issues and became the complete story we now know. So the very existence of The Boys as a finished work is partly thanks to a publisher willing to let Ennis go where he wanted to go without interference. That creative freedom is baked into the DNA of the source material, and you can feel it in the tone of everything that followed. Now let's talk about the show itself, because the journey from comic page to streaming platform was anything but smooth. The Boys television series was actually developed first for the American Broadcast Network. It was originally set up at Cinemax, which is an HBO subsidiary. The show was being built for that platform when Amazon Studios stepped in and acquired it. That transition happened in 2018 when Amazon picked up the show and immediately ordered it straight to series. No pilot, no development limbo. They saw what the creative team was building and committed to it right away. That kind of confidence from a streamer is rare, and it changed the trajectory of the show entirely because Amazon gave the creative team the freedom and the budget to go places that a traditional network never would have allowed. Eric Kripke, who most people know as the creator of Supernatural, was the showrunner brought in to adapt the material. And this is where it gets interesting, because Kripke had actually been trying to develop The Boys for television for years before it finally happened. His persistence with this particular property is part of why the show has such a clear and consistent vision. This wasn't a project handed to him. He fought to make it exist. Let's talk about casting, because there are some genuinely surprising stories here that most casual fans have never heard. Karl Urban, who plays Billy Butcher, one of the most iconic characters in the show, almost didn't take the role. According to what he has shared in interviews, he was initially uncertain about committing to a television series because he had primarily built his career in film. Urban had done major blockbuster franchises including Star Trek and Lord of the Rings. The idea of transitioning to a streaming series was a bigger mental shift than people might assume. What ultimately convinced him was the quality of the writing and the character himself. Billy Butcher is genuinely one of the most complex anti-heroes in modern television, and Urban recognized that. The rest is history, obviously, but that near miss is worth sitting with. Now here is something that surprises people when they find out. Anthony Starr, the actor who plays Homelander, the main antagonist of the series, is actually from New Zealand. His natural accent is nothing like the all-American voice he uses for the character. Starr has spoken about how he actually spent significant time developing the specific Midwestern American quality to Homelander's speech, understanding that the voice was as important as the physicality of the character. The way Homelander speaks is part of what makes him feel simultaneously approachable and deeply threatening. That contrast is entirely intentional, and Starr engineered it deliberately. What's even more interesting about Starr's portrayal is something he has described in interviews about his approach to the character. He doesn't play Homelander as a villain. He plays him as a person who genuinely believes he deserves everything he demands. That distinction completely changes how the performance lands. When you watch Homelander have a breakdown, it doesn't feel like a supervillain losing control. It feels like a deeply damaged person who never developed emotional regulation because no one ever held him accountable for anything. That psychological specificity is what elevates the performance from impressive to genuinely disturbing. Let's keep going, because we are just getting started, and the production side of this show has details that are absolutely wild. The cape and costume design for the Seven, the show's superhero team, went through extensive development processes that most viewers never think about. Each costume was designed to simultaneously feel like a genuine superhero outfit and also carry an element of corporate branding. The design team actually studied real-world sports team uniforms and celebrity branding campaigns when developing the looks for the Seven because within the world of the show, these are essentially brand ambassadors as much as they are heroes. Every detail, including the colors, the materials, and the logo placement, was informed by marketing research. That level of world-building detail in the costume department is genuinely impressive. Here's something wild about the production that actually affects how you watch the show. The flying sequences for Homelander were among the most technically challenging shots in the series. The production team used a combination of practical wire work, green screen technology, and digital effects that have evolved significantly across the seasons. In the earlier episodes, the team was still developing the methodology, and there are subtle differences in how flight looks compared to the later seasons. Once you know this, you start noticing the visual refinements as the show progressed. Now let's shift to something that gets into the deeper meaning of the show because this is where it genuinely gets fascinating. Eric Kripke has been remarkably transparent in interviews about the political and social commentary embedded throughout The Boys. The show uses superheroes as a stand-in for unchecked corporate power, celebrity culture, and the gap between public image and private behavior. Kripke has specifically discussed how Vought International, the corporation that controls the Seven and essentially owns the superhero narrative in the show's world, was modeled after real media and entertainment corporations. The idea was to examine what happens when the entities that are supposed to protect people are more invested in protecting their own brand and revenue streams than in actually doing right by the public. What makes this commentary so effective is that it doesn't preach. The show trusts the audience to draw their own conclusions. The satirical elements are embedded in the story rather than delivered as lectures, and that's a delicate balance to maintain across multiple seasons and dozens of episodes. Now here is a fact that blows people's minds when they find out about it. The show has an internal Bible, a detailed document that outlines the world's rules, the history of Compound V, the corporate structure of Vought, and the backstories of every major superhero in the universe. This document is reportedly extraordinarily detailed, running to hundreds of pages. Kripke and the writers' room worked on this before a single episode was filmed because they understood that the satirical world they were building needed internal consistency to land its punches effectively. When a show's universe feels real, the commentary embedded in it hits harder. That investment in world building paid off. Let's talk about Compound V for a second because the show's mythology around how people become superheroes is actually one of its most clever inversions of the genre. In most superhero stories, powers are either innate, the result of accident, or achieved through extraordinary circumstances. In the Boys universe, Compound V is a manufactured product. It's a drug. And the implications of that distinction ripple through everything. Superpowers become something that can be created, sold, weaponized, and controlled by whoever holds the patent. Vought doesn't just manage superheroes. They manufacture them, which means every superhero in this world is also a product. That's not just dark. It's genuinely unsettling in a way that feels uncomfortably relevant to conversations about pharmaceutical influence and corporate ownership of biological processes. The show has leaned into this mythology more deeply in each season, expanding the lore around Compound V and exploring what it means that something presented to the public as miraculous and natural is actually a corporate invention with a very specific and troubling history. Now let's get into some behind-the-scenes facts that are a little more personal and surprising. Jack Quaid, who plays Huey Campbell, the audience's entry point into the show's world, is the son of actors Dennis Quaid and Meg Ryan. This is something people sometimes know, but what's less discussed is how deliberately Jack Quaid brings a sense of genuine relatability and vulnerability to Huey that is completely essential to how the show functions. Huey is not a cool character. He's not powerful, not intimidating, not particularly competent in the early going. He's the person in an extraordinary situation who doesn't really know what he's doing, and that's intentional. Having an everyman center character in a show this extreme gives viewers a consistent emotional anchor. Quaid's ability to make that character feel authentic rather than simply naive is underappreciated. There's also something worth noting about the dynamic between Jack Quaid and Carl Urban on set, which both actors have spoken about positively. Their characters have a fundamentally difficult relationship, full of tension and conflict, but the two actors developed a genuine working rapport that helps sell the complicated dynamic between Butcher and Huey. Sometimes the best on-screen chemistry comes from off-screen professional respect, and that appears to be exactly what happened here. Let's talk about Erin Moriarty, who plays Annie January, also known as Starlight. Her arc across the series is one of the most emotionally substantial journeys in the whole show. But here's something about her character's development that speaks to how the writers approach their source material. In the original comic, Annie's character goes through extremely dark material that Moriarty and the showrunners chose to handle very differently in the adaptation. The television version of Starlight is more fully developed as a complete person with agency and a genuine moral perspective. The show took what was in the source material and built something more nuanced around it, which is a choice that not all adaptations make successfully. The fact that Starlight feels like one of the most grounded and real characters in a show full of extreme personalities is a testament to both the writing and Moriarty's performance. Now I want to spend a moment on Tomer Capone, who plays Frenchie, because his background is fascinating. Capone is an Israeli actor, and Frenchie is one of those characters who could easily have become a caricature. The European accent, the eccentric personality, the particular set of skills. In lesser hands with lesser writing, it could have been a one-note character. Instead, Frenchie is consistently one of the most emotionally affecting characters in the show. Capone brings a warmth and a genuine humanity to scenes that balance the show's more brutal elements. His chemistry with Karen Fukuhara, who plays Kamiko, created one of the most beloved relationships in the entire series. Speaking of Fukuhara, here's something genuinely impressive about her work on the show. Kamiko is a character who does not speak for much of the series. She communicates through expression, physicality, and eventually sign language. Playing a character without conventional dialogue is an extraordinary acting challenge, and Fukuhara makes Kamiko one of the most expressive and emotionally readable characters in the whole cast. That's not an accident. It reflects both her skill and deliberate choices about how to tell a story without words. Here's something about the show's music that most people haven't thought about. The soundtrack and score of The Boys is part of how the show weaponizes familiarity. Music you associate with comfort, patriotism, and heroism gets used in contexts that make those associations deeply uncomfortable. This is a deliberate strategy. When you hear something that sounds like an inspiring superhero theme underscoring something genuinely terrible, the cognitive dissonance creates a specific kind of unease that pure horror or drama can't achieve. The music team understood that they weren't just scoring scenes. They were participating in the show's satirical project. The show has also made extensive use of pop songs in ways that create jarring contrast. A bright, upbeat popular song playing over a scene of violence or corporate manipulation doesn't feel random. It feels like a comment on how culture packages darkness with palatable surfaces. Once you notice this pattern in the show, you can't stop noticing it. Let's get into some facts about the show's viewership and cultural impact because the numbers here are remarkable. When The Boys premiered on Amazon Prime Video in July 2019, it immediately became one of the most watched original series on the platform. But what happened between the first and second seasons is interesting. The gap between Season 1 and Season 2 saw the show's cultural footprint grow enormously, partly because audiences had time to discover it during streaming, share it with friends, and build the kind of word-of-mouth momentum that streaming shows often struggle to generate in real time. By the time Season 2 arrived, the show had become a genuine cultural phenomenon. The second season also benefited from the specific moment in which it landed. It arrived in late 2020, during an incredibly charged political and social period, and the show's themes about power, corruption, media manipulation, and the danger of charismatic authority felt almost uncomfortably timely. Kripke and the writers have talked about how they sometimes felt like they were writing satire and reality was trying to keep pace with them, which is not a comfortable position for a showrunner to be in. Now here is a fact about the show's production that speaks to the sheer scale of what they built. The show films primarily in Toronto, Canada, which stands in for the fictional Vought-controlled American city where much of the action takes place. The production design team does extraordinary work making Toronto look and feel like an American corporate environment, but there are subtle moments where the Canadian setting peeks through if you know what to look for. The production has spoken about this as both a practical challenge and a creative puzzle. Making a show that is fundamentally about American cultural pathologies while filming in Canada requires a specific kind of deliberate production design that the team has pulled off impressively well. Let's circle back to something deeper because I want to make sure we cover the aspects of this show that go beyond fun production trivia and get into why it actually matters. The Boys is genuinely unique in how it handles the question of power and accountability. Most superhero stories, even the ones that try to be dark or subversive, ultimately affirm the idea that there are good people in positions of extraordinary power and those good people will use that power responsibly. The Boys rejects this premise almost entirely. In the world of the show, the existence of unchecked power is itself the problem, regardless of who holds it. Even the most sympathetic characters in positions of power make choices that compromise their principles because the systems around them reward compromise and punish integrity. This is a genuinely radical position for a mainstream entertainment property to take and hold consistently across multiple seasons. It's one of the reasons the show generates the kind of passionate engagement it does. It's not just entertaining. It's making an argument. And whether you agree with that argument or not, the clarity of the show's moral vision is part of what makes it so compelling. Here is a behind-the-scenes fact that might genuinely surprise you. The showroom for The Boys apparently operates with an unusually open process for pitching story ideas. Writers at various levels of experience and seniority have reportedly been encouraged to bring their most extreme and unexpected ideas to the table, with the understanding that the show's premise creates space for almost any kind of social commentary if it's handled with craft. This kind of creative culture is relatively rare in television production, where hierarchy and creative gatekeeping are common. The result is a show that consistently surprises its audience because the writers themselves are encouraged to surprise each other. The spin-off series Gen V, which focuses on college-age superheroes in training at a Vought-funded university, came directly out of this creative expansion. The Boys universe is large enough and coherent enough internally that it could support an entirely separate show with its own tone and set of concerns. Gen V leaned more heavily into horror and the specific anxieties of younger generations navigating a world shaped by forces beyond their control, and it worked because the world-building foundation was solid enough to support it. Let me share something about how the show approaches its most extreme content because this is actually important context that changes how you might think about certain scenes. The most graphic and disturbing moments in The Boys are not included for shock value alone. This is something Kripke has addressed directly. The show operates on a principle that extreme content has to carry thematic weight. When something viscerally uncomfortable happens on screen, it's supposed to make you feel something specific about power, about entitlement, about the ways institutions protect people who should face consequences. The discomfort is functional. It's designed to make you sit with something that polished storytelling would let you look away from. This doesn't mean every viewer will appreciate the approach. The show is genuinely not for everyone, and that's by design. But understanding that the most extreme moments are intentional and structured rather than random helps clarify what the show is actually doing. Here's a fact about Homelander specifically that I find endlessly fascinating. The character was deliberately designed to evoke a very specific type of American mythology. He looks like the idealized version of a patriotic hero, blonde, square-jawed, wearing the colors of the American flag. Everything about his visual presentation is designed to trigger associations with heroism, safety, and American exceptionalism. The show then systematically dismantles those associations by showing you who Homelander actually is beneath the image. The visual design is essentially a trap that the show sets for the audience, using the instinctive comfort we feel around those symbols against us. Anthony Starr has described understanding this function of the character as central to how he plays him. Homelander has to be genuinely appealing in certain moments because if he was simply repulsive from the start, the critique wouldn't land. The danger of people like Homelander is precisely that they are compelling. That's the whole point. Now let me give you something that connects the show back to its comic roots in an interesting way. Garth Ennis, the original comic writer, has spoken about his mixed feelings regarding the television adaptation. He has been generally positive about the show's existence and its success, but he has also noted that the television version makes different choices than he would have made, particularly in terms of which characters receive sympathetic treatment and which storylines get expanded or compressed. This is normal for adaptations, but Ennis's perspective is interesting because it highlights just how much the television version is its own creative work rather than a faithful translation of the source material. The show has genuinely gone beyond the comics in terms of runtime and story development. With multiple seasons running to many episodes each, the television version has explored characters and storylines that the comics either handled briefly or didn't develop at all. In some ways, the show has created a more expansive version of this world than even the original creator envisioned, which is a remarkable thing to happen in an adaptation. Let's talk about the international dimensions of this show's success because they're genuinely impressive. The Boys became one of the first Amazon original series to achieve truly global viewership numbers that competed with the largest streaming hits from any platform. The show found audiences in markets where superhero content had previously been dominated by the major Hollywood franchises, and in many of those markets the show's critique of American corporate and cultural power actually resonated in ways that were distinct from how American audiences engaged with it. Watching a show that deconstructs American cultural mythology from outside that culture hits differently, and that international engagement says something meaningful about the show's reach. Here is one more production fact that I think deserves attention. The stunt work on The Boys is extraordinary and largely underappreciated. The show features incredibly complex action sequences that involve practical stunt work combined with digital enhancement, and the stunt performers who execute these sequences operate under extraordinary pressure given the show's visual demands. Several of the show's regular cast members have done significant amounts of their own stunt work in order to maintain the visual continuity of action sequences. Carl Urban in particular has spoken about the physical demands of playing Butcher across multiple seasons, and how the action sequences have evolved in complexity as the show's budget and ambitions have grown. The fight choreography also carries thematic meaning in the show. The way the boys fight compared to the way the Seven operate in combat reflects the power imbalance at the core of the show's premise. Normal humans against superhumans require completely different tactical approaches, and the choreography team developed a specific language for how each group fights that reinforces the show's underlying dynamics. Now here's something to consider as we come toward the end of this, and it connects everything we've been talking about. The Boys works because it takes its premise completely seriously. It doesn't wink at the audience. It doesn't soften its most uncomfortable implications. It commits to the internal logic of a world where corporate power has captured the function of heroism itself and asks what that world actually looks like for the people living in it. And the answer it gives is messy, painful, frequently darkly funny, and ultimately more honest than the polished fantasy of most superhero entertainment. The facts we've covered today, from the comic's troubled origins to the casting near misses, from the deliberate costume design to the thematic architecture of the score, from the political timing of the show's biggest seasons to the psychological specificity of the performances, all of these details point toward the same conclusion. The Boys is not an accident. Every element of it is the result of deliberate creative choices made by people who understood exactly what they were trying to do and fought to do it without compromise. That's what separates it from shows that simply try to be edgy or provocative. Edge without purpose is just noise. The Boys has always known what it's saying and why it needs to say it that way. That's why years after its premiere, it still generates conversation, debate, and passionate engagement from its audience. It earns that engagement by respecting the audience enough to never simplify its own argument. So the next time you watch an episode and something makes you deeply uncomfortable, sit with that feeling instead of immediately reaching for the remote. The discomfort is the point. The show is doing exactly what it set out to do. And knowing the history and intention behind it doesn't make it less impactful. It actually makes it more. If you've made it this far and there's a fact in here that genuinely surprised you or changed how you think about the show, drop it in the comments. I want to know which one hit different for you. And if you want more deep dives like this one into the shows and properties that actually have layers worth exploring, make sure you're subscribed because there is a lot more coming. See you in the next one. Look, I've been watching superhero content for years. I've sat through every Marvel phase, every DC reboot, every streaming disaster. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, has grabbed me by the throat and refused to let go quite like the boys. And here's the thing that keeps me up at night. Most people think they know this show. They've watched it, they've talked about it, they've argued about it online. But I promise you, by the time this video ends, you're going to realize you barely scratched the surface of what's actually going on beneath the layers of blood, satire, and absolute chaos that makes this show one of the most brilliant pieces of television ever created. So stay with me, because some of what I'm about to tell you is going to change how you watch every single episode again. Let's start with something that sounds simple but is actually one of the most deliberately crafted decisions the show has ever made. The name Vought International is not random. The creators drew inspiration from real defense contractors and entertainment conglomerates to build a company that feels disturbingly familiar. Vought is essentially a composite nightmare of every major corporation you've ever had a complicated relationship with. It sells the idea of superheroes the same way a fast food chain sells the idea of happiness. The product looks amazing in the marketing. The reality is something entirely different. And that deliberate parallel to modern corporate America is baked into every single logo placement, every press conference, every smile Homelander flashes for the cameras. Now here's where things get really interesting. Karl Urban, the man who plays Billy Butcher, one of the most beloved characters in the entire show, almost didn't take the role. He had serious reservations. Not because he didn't love the character, but because he wasn't sure the show could actually pull off what it was attempting to do. The source material, the original comic series written by Garth Ennis, is genuinely extreme. We are talking about content that makes even the most shocking moments in the show look like a warm-up. Urban needed to be convinced that the television adaptation would find the right balance between being genuinely provocative and being gratuitous for no reason. Once the showrunner Eric Kripke got him on the phone and laid out the vision, Urban was in. And if you've ever watched Urban in an interview talking about Butcher, you can see that he didn't just take a job. He took on an identity. Speaking of Karl Urban, did you know that his accent in the show required more preparation than almost any other aspect of his performance? Urban is from New Zealand. Billy Butcher is from London's East End. Those are not remotely similar sounds. Urban worked with dialect coaches for an extended period before filming began, and he has spoken in interviews about how he essentially had to rebuild the way he physically forms words to make Butcher sound authentic. What's fascinating is that the accent itself becomes a character. There's a roughness to it, a working-class aggression that tells you everything about where Butcher came from before you even learn his backstory. That's not accident. That's craft. But let's talk about the character who arguably carries the most psychological weight in the entire show. Homelander. Played with terrifying precision by Anthony Starr, a New Zealand actor who, much like Urban, had to completely shed his natural voice and presence to inhabit this role. What most people don't realize is that Homelander was specifically designed to be a deconstruction of Superman, but not the cynical kind of deconstruction that just makes a hero evil for shock value. The writers wanted to ask a genuinely disturbing question. What would a person actually be like if they grew up with those abilities, in that kind of isolation, subjected to that kind of experimental pressure from birth, with no normal human development, no genuine love, no real sense of consequence? The answer they arrived at is Homelander. And it's horrifying because it makes sense. Anthony Starr has talked extensively about the preparation that went into Homelander psychology. He based elements of the character on research into narcissistic personality disorder, abandonment trauma, and the specific psychological profiles of cult leaders. That smile that Homelander does, the one that sends chills down your spine even when he's supposed to be doing something heroic, that was developed intentionally. Starr described it as the smile of someone who has learned that smiling gets you what you want, but who doesn't actually feel what the smile is supposed to represent. It's a mask that occasionally slips. And when it slips, that's when you see what's underneath. And what's underneath is something that didn't get enough of the right things when it needed the most. Now let me tell you something that genuinely blew my mind when I first came across it. The show films primarily in Toronto, Canada, but the production design team works overtime to make it feel like various American cities. The reason Toronto is used is partly financial, because Canadian production incentives make large-scale television significantly cheaper to produce, but also because the city's architecture is versatile enough to double for multiple American locations with the right dressing. What's remarkable is how successfully this works. The Vought Tower, the streets, the neighborhoods, all of it has been built, dressed, and filtered to feel distinctly American in its visual language. It's a deliberate construction of a place that represents America without actually being America. Which, when you think about the show's themes around image versus reality, feels oddly appropriate. Let's get into the comic books for a second, because the relationship between the source material and the show is one of the most fascinating production stories in recent television history. Garth Ennis wrote the original Boys comic series starting in 2006. He created it as a genuinely angry, frequently grotesque response to what he saw as the sanitization of superhero stories and the cultural moment of the mid-2000s. The comic does not hold back. In ways that would be essentially impossible to put directly on a streaming platform, it goes to places that are designed to make you uncomfortable on a fundamental level. When Amazon picked up the adaptation, the challenge was enormous. How do you take source material that operates at a kind of creative extreme and translate it into something that keeps the spirit, keeps the rage, keeps the satire, but also functions as prestige television that can reach a mainstream audience? Eric Kripke's answer was to treat the comic as a starting point rather than a blueprint. Significant characters were reconceived. Story arcs were restructured. Tonal adjustments were made that changed some aspects dramatically. And in many cases, the show actually deepens the ideas that the comic introduced by giving them more space to breathe and more contemporary cultural targets to aim at. The result is something that longtime comic readers often find surprising, not because the show is worse, but because it becomes its own thing with its own logic and its own distinct personality. One specific example that's worth mentioning is the character of Starlight, played by Erin Moriarty. In the comics, Starlight's arc is significant but differs in some important structural ways from what the show does with her. The television version of Starlight transforms into something much more central and much more emotionally resonant than her comic counterpart. She becomes the show's moral compass in a way that gives the audience someone to orient around, someone whose perspective shifts alongside theirs as the world of Vought is slowly revealed to be exactly as corrupt as the most cynical person in the room always suspected. Moriarty herself has spoken about how the character evolved significantly through the writing process, and that she had ongoing conversations with the writers about who Annie January really is beneath the superhero identity. Here's a detail that a lot of viewers miss entirely. The Seven, the elite superhero team at the center of the show, is deliberately structured to parallel the Justice League in ways that go beyond just the obvious Homelander and Superman comparison. Each member maps onto a DC icon in a way that then exposes something specific about that archetype. The Deep has elements that parallel Aquaman, complete with the complicated relationship to an underwater identity that the character is made to feel embarrassed about. Queen Maeve has Wonder Woman energy, a warrior with ancient strength who has been so thoroughly compromised by corporate machinery that she can barely remember who she was before Vought got their hands on her. A-Train has a Flash parallel, a speedster whose entire identity has been consumed by the performance of being a speedster, to the point where the performance and the person have become almost indistinguishable. By setting up these parallels, the show can then systematically interrogate every assumption that the original archetypes carry with them. What does Aquaman look like when the idea of being a sea-based hero is turned into a branding opportunity? What does Wonder Woman look like after decades of being told by men in suits how to present herself to a public that will never fully understand her? The answers are uncomfortable because they're meant to be. Now let's talk about the production side for a moment, because the practical effects work on this show deserves way more recognition than it typically gets. The Boys is famous for its shocking visual moments. The whale scene, the first episode's ending, various other sequences that viewers tend to describe in hushed, slightly traumatized tones to people who haven't seen the show yet. What most people don't realize is how much of this is achieved through a combination of practical effects and digital work that is genuinely innovative. The effects teams have won industry recognition for their work precisely because the challenge is so unusual. Most visual effects work is about making something fantastical look real. On The Boys, the challenge is often making something real look even more viscerally present than it would naturally feel. The goal isn't seamless integration. The goal is impact. The exploding heads, a recurring motif in the show, require careful coordination between the practical effects department and the digital team. The initial physics of the event is often done practically, with rigs and materials that create a genuinely physical result, and then that physical result is extended and enhanced digitally to reach the precise level of visual intensity the scene requires. It sounds technical, and it is, but the reason it matters is because you can feel it. There's a texture to the show's violence that CGI alone could never achieve, and that texture is what makes the show's horror land with such force. Let me shift to something a little more unexpected. The music supervision on The Boys is doing something genuinely clever that I think flies under the radar for a lot of viewers. The song choices in this show are not just atmosphere or tone setting. They are editorial commentary. When you hear a specific piece of music playing over a specific scene, the show is often doing something deliberately ironic or confrontational, using the cultural associations of the song to create a third layer of meaning that exists between the scene's surface narrative and its emotional subtext. The most famous example might be the use of an upbeat, familiar piece of music playing over something deeply disturbing. The contrast creates a specific emotional texture that the show has made almost a signature. But the more you watch with attention to the music, the more you realize that every choice is intentional. The showrunners have talked about spending significant time in the writer's room discussing what a particular scene's music should achieve thematically, not just emotionally. That level of deliberateness in music supervision is rare in television, and it contributes enormously to the show's distinctive feel. Now, I want to talk about something that I think represents the deepest layer of what The Boys is actually doing. And this is the part where I want you to really pay attention. The show is, at its core, about power. Specifically about what happens to people and institutions when accountability disappears. The superheroes in the world of The Boys operate with impunity not because they're evil by nature, but because the system that surrounds them has been designed to protect them from consequences. Vought doesn't just sell heroes. Vought manufactures the conditions under which heroes can do whatever they want and never face a reckoning. Sound familiar? What Kripke and his writer's room have consistently done across the show's run is update their satirical targets to reflect the specific moment in which each season was being produced and released. The show has addressed media manipulation, social media culture, the celebrity industrial complex, political extremism, corporate immunity, and the way that charisma can be weaponized against populations who are desperate for someone to believe in. These aren't background elements. They're the actual subject matter that the superhero aesthetic is being used to examine. In interviews, Kripke has been remarkably transparent about the fact that the show is political by design, not by accident. He has specifically discussed wanting to create content that could cut through the noise of an extremely saturated media environment by being so viscerally entertaining that viewers would engage with ideas they might otherwise avoid. The superheroes are the delivery mechanism. The ideas are the payload. Here's something about the casting process that I find endlessly fascinating. Jack Quaid, who plays Huey Campbell, the closest thing the show has to a traditional audience surrogate and everyman protagonist, was cast in part because of a quality the producers identified as essential and genuinely rare. He reads as genuinely decent. In a show populated by characters who are compromised, damaged, corrupted, or operating in moral gray zones of varying density, Huey needs to function as the viewer's point of entry. He can't be too naive or he's annoying. He can't be too savvy or he loses the quality that makes him sympathetic. Quaid threads this needle in a way that even the writers have described as unexpectedly precise. What's interesting is that Quaid comes from significant entertainment industry family background, being the son of two well-known actors, and yet his interpretation of Huey is so grounded and specific that it never feels like a legacy casting choice. He did something distinct with the character. There's a quality of performance in Quaid's work that suggests genuine investment in who Huey is as a person, and that investment pays off across the arc of the series in ways that become increasingly clear as Huey is put through more and more pressure. Let me tell you about a behind-the-scenes element that surprised me when I first learned about it. The writer's room for The Boys is unusually large and unusually diverse in its composition compared to typical cable or streaming dramas. Kripke has made specific choices about who is in that room and what range of perspectives and experiences those writers bring. This has a direct impact on the show's content in ways you might not expect. The storylines that deal with race, with gender, with sexuality, with class, are not being written from a single homogeneous perspective and then polished. They're being generated and challenged by a room full of people who have different stakes in those conversations. The result is that the show's political commentary, even when it's provocative or uncomfortable, tends to have a specificity and an accountability to it that pure satire sometimes lacks. Now let's go somewhere that I think is genuinely surprising for most viewers. The relationship between The Boys and professional wrestling is something that the creative team has acknowledged, and that is built into the show's DNA in ways that aren't immediately obvious. Professional wrestling, at its core, is about characters who are presented as real performing narratives that everyone knows are constructed, while both the performers and the audience participate in a collective agreement to engage with those narratives as if they're genuine. This is called kayfabe, and it is exactly what Vought does with superheroes. The superheroes are performing characters. The public knows on some level that they're being sold something. And yet the emotional investment is real because the need that the performance fulfills is real. Homelander's rallies have the energy of wrestling heels working a crowd. The crowd knows they're being played, but the feeling they get from the playing is genuine, and that genuine feeling is the actual product being sold. This parallel between superhero culture and professional wrestling is something the show has leaned into increasingly, and it explains a lot about why Homelander's relationship with his fan base feels so eerily familiar. Here's another production detail that's worth knowing about. Filming the Homelander laser eye sequences requires an extraordinary amount of practical on-set work that then gets enhanced in post-production. Anthony Starr has to perform in very specific physical ways with specific eye directions and facial tensions to create the base footage that the effects team can then work with. In interviews, Starr has described the experience of performing a laser sequence as requiring a kind of physical concentration that is different from regular acting work because you're committing to a physical action while knowing that the actual visible result of that action will only exist in post-production. You have to be fully present in something you can't actually see. Let's talk about Soldier Boy for a moment, because the addition of Jensen Ackles to the cast in the third season is one of the more interesting casting decisions in the show's run. Ackles came into The Boys with an enormous existing fan base from his years as Dean Winchester on Supernatural, a show Eric Kripke actually created. That relationship between Kripke and Ackles spans more than a decade of creative collaboration, and the decision to bring Ackles into The Boys universe is loaded with that history. Kripke has been clear in interviews that he wanted Ackles specifically and wrote the role of Soldier Boy with that casting in mind. What's interesting about Soldier Boy as a character is that he functions as a deconstructed version of the classic American hero archetype, specifically the World War II era heroism mythology that American culture has used to construct a specific self-image. Soldier Boy is what happens when the mythology of American greatness is stripped down to its actual human components, and you have to reckon with what's actually there. Ackles' performance brings a quality that's essential to making this work. There's a genuine star presence to him, a physical confidence and charisma that makes it credible that this person could have been a symbol. And then the show systematically reveals the gap between the symbol and the reality. It's classic Boys territory but executed with particular effectiveness because the casting itself does part of the thematic work. I want to circle back to something about Homelander that I think is the most psychologically interesting aspect of the entire show. The character's core wound is not about power. It's about love. Specifically, the absence of it during the developmental period when human beings are most vulnerable to its absence. Homelander was raised in a laboratory. The people who had authority over him treated him as an asset rather than a child. He was never taught to attach to other people in a healthy way because the environment he was raised in did not permit healthy attachment. The result is a being with the power of a god and the emotional architecture of someone who never learned how to be safe. This is why Homelander's rages look the way they do. They don't look like the calculated evil of a villain who has chosen a path. They look like the eruptions of someone who has never had the internal resources to regulate the size of what they feel. When Homelander destroys something, there's a quality to it that reads as terrifyingly childlike. Not innocent. The opposite of innocent. But childlike in the sense that the proportion between the stimulus and the response belongs to someone who was never given the tools to close that gap. Anthony Starr and the writers have described working through this psychology in granular detail, specifically because they wanted Homelander to be frightening in a way that was also comprehensible. Not sympathetic necessarily, but comprehensible. Because a villain who is purely and simply evil is not as frightening as a villain whose damage you can trace back to a source. One more production element that I think is really worth highlighting. The show's costume design is doing constant visual storytelling that functions completely independently of the dialogue and the action. Every superhero costume is designed as a statement about who that character is presenting themselves to be and what that presentation is concealing. Homelander's suit is the most obvious example. Its American flags and primary colors and the visual language of classical superhero design. And it sits on a man whose interior reality is the opposite of everything those design choices are supposed to represent. The costume is a lie, and it's designed to read as one once you know the character, while still being designed to read as the real thing to the crowd. The boys' look, the working class, lived-in, practical aesthetic of their clothing and their environment, is equally deliberate. They wear what people wear when they're not performing anything, when they're just surviving. The contrast between the visual register of the superheroes and the visual register of the boys themselves is a constant silent argument the show is making about authenticity and performance. Let me give you something you can take away from this video and use the next time you're watching the show. When you watch a scene involving Homelander and a crowd of supporters, pay attention to where his eyes go when the crowd responds to something he's said. There's specific performance work in those moments. Starr has talked about playing Homelander's reaction to crowd approval as the closest thing the character ever gets to feeling genuinely fed. Not happy. Federation. Like the love of the crowd is a substance that fills something in him temporarily without ever actually nourishing him. And if you watch for that specific quality in those moments, you'll see it. It changes how the rallies feel. They stop being scenes of power and become scenes of hunger. That recontextualization is available throughout the show once you know where to look. The Boys rewards close attention in a way that a lot of action-oriented content doesn't bother to earn. The surface level is extremely entertaining on its own terms. But underneath that surface is a show that has done the work of a genuinely serious piece of culture, one that has something real and uncomfortable to say about the world that made it. Now here's something that I think is genuinely underappreciated when people talk about the show's legacy. The Boys arrived at a specific cultural moment. Superhero content had reached a kind of total market saturation. Every major studio had a shared universe. Every streaming service was developing cape content. The genre had become so dominant that it was starting to collapse under its own weight, with audiences showing early signs of fatigue in a way that the studios were struggling to acknowledge. Into that moment came a show that was not anti-superhero in the simple sense of just replacing good guys with bad guys. It was something more surgically precise than that. It was a show that identified the specific psychological needs that superhero stories fulfill in their audience, and then asked what happens when those needs are exploited rather than genuinely met. That question landed because it was the right question at the right time. And it landed in a way that didn't alienate the audience who loved superheroes. It landed in a way that made that audience think more clearly about what they were loving and why. That's a difficult creative trick to pull off, and the show pulls it off consistently across its run. The show's commercial success, which has been significant, is itself a kind of argument the show is making. It became one of the most watched properties on its platform. It generated enormous cultural conversation. It spawned spin-off content. All of this happened because it was doing something that the content it was criticizing had stopped doing, which was treating its audience as intelligent adults who deserved to have genuinely challenging ideas delivered to them inside genuinely entertaining packaging. And that, ultimately, might be the most interesting fact about The Boys. Not any specific behind-the-scenes detail, not any specific performance choice, not any specific production decision, though all of those are fascinating and worth knowing. The most interesting fact is that it exists at all. That a show this angry, this political, this willing to be genuinely offensive in service of genuine ideas, found an audience of millions. That it became mainstream without becoming safe. That it influenced how the industry thinks about superhero content at exactly the moment when that influence was needed. If you've been watching this show and you've enjoyed it without fully understanding why it hits differently than everything else in the genre, I hope this video gave you some of what you were looking for. The craft is visible once you know where to look. The intentions are accessible once someone points you toward them. And the experience of going back and watching with all of this in your head is something I genuinely recommend. Because there's a version of watching The Boys where you're just along for the ride, and the ride is genuinely excellent. But there's another version where you're watching a group of extraordinarily talented people who are angry about real things using the most entertaining possible vehicle to say those things as loudly as they can. That version is better. Drop in the comments which facts surprised you the most. And if you want more deep dives into the shows and films that are doing things that deserve more attention and more analysis, hit that subscribe button because this channel is exactly that. See you in the next one. Look, I've watched The Boys probably 3 times through at this point, and every single time I think I've figured it all out, something new hits me. A piece of trivia, a behind-the-scenes detail, a connection I completely missed. And I know I'm not alone in that because this show has one of the most obsessive fan bases on the entire internet. So today we are going digging. Deep. We are going places the subreddits haven't fully explored, pulling back the curtain on production secrets, character decisions, wild real-world inspirations, and details so small they had to be intentional. By the end of this video, I promise you will see The Boys completely differently. Let's get into it. So let's start with something that will immediately reframe how you think about the entire show. Garth Ennis, the comic book writer who created The Boys back in 2006, has openly admitted that he wrote the original story as a direct response to his frustration with the superhero genre itself. He wasn't a fan. Like, genuinely not a fan of the direction Marvel and DC were taking things. He thought superheroes had become these sanitized, corporate mascots that companies use to push merchandise and maintain a stranglehold on popular culture. So he created a comic that was essentially the most violent, disgusting, disturbing deconstruction of that world he could possibly imagine. But here's the fascinating part. When Amazon picked it up for television, the showrunner Eric Kripke and his team had to figure out how to adapt material that was, in many places, genuinely unpublishable in terms of mainstream content. And the direction they chose was to make the satire smarter, more pointed, more directly connected to real-world corporate and political power structures. The show became less about gross shock value and more about something that actually made audiences uncomfortable for intellectual reasons. That's a massive creative pivot, and it changed everything about what The Boys became. Now let's talk about Anthony Starr, who plays Homelander, because the performance choices he made for that character are so calculated it borders on scary. Starr has talked in interviews about how he approached Homelander not as a villain but as a deeply traumatized individual who happens to have the power of a god and zero emotional regulation. He spent a lot of time thinking about what it would actually do to a human psyche to never have experienced genuine love or connection as a child, to have been raised in a laboratory environment where you are simultaneously the most powerful being on the planet and completely powerless over your own life. The laser eyes, the flying, the invincibility, none of that is what makes Homelander terrifying. What makes him terrifying is that smile. Starr worked specifically on what he called the mask, this performance of warmth and charm that Homelander deploys publicly, and the way that mask slips when he's alone or when he feels genuinely threatened. If you go back and watch early Season 1 scenes knowing that framework, it completely transforms what you're watching. You start catching these micro-expressions, these tiny moments where the mask flickers. It's genuinely one of the most technically brilliant performances in television history, and it doesn't get talked about enough. Jumping over to Carl Urban, who plays Billy Butcher, and there's a detail here most people don't know. Urban is from New Zealand, and Butcher is written as a British character, specifically from London. Urban has a natural New Zealand accent, which is nothing like a London working-class accent. The preparation he put into that accent was extensive, and Urban has said that the voice, the way Butcher speaks, became the key to unlocking the entire character for him. The accent wasn't just cosmetic. It was psychological. Because when you adopt a completely different voice, a different rhythm of speaking, a different way of landing words, you actually start thinking differently. Urban described it as finding a character from the outside in, which is the opposite of how most actors approach a role. Most people find the internal emotional truth first and let the external details follow. Urban built the shell and discovered who Butcher was by living inside that shell. And honestly, it works. There's never a moment where Butcher feels like Carl Urban playing dress-up. He feels like a completely real, completely separate human being. Here's one that genuinely blew my mind when I first found it. The character of A-Train, who is the seventh speedster and who the show uses to explore themes of racial inequality, celebrity, and exploitation, was actually developed with a very specific real-world parallel in mind. The creators drew heavily from the history of black athletes in American professional sports, particularly from the early to mid-20th century, when black performers and athletes were welcomed into white entertainment spaces as long as they were providing value, and then discarded or diminished the moment their utility expired. A-Train's entire arc, especially in the earlier seasons, is essentially a metaphor for that dynamic translated into a superhero context. He's fast enough to be useful to Vought, presentable enough to be marketable, but never given genuine power within the organization. And the moment his heart condition threatens his usefulness, the corporation moves to replace him without a second thought. Jesse T. Usher, who plays A-Train, has talked about how much that historical context shaped the way he played the character's specific brand of internal conflict, the tension between knowing you're being exploited and still wanting to be in the room because the alternative is worse. Let's shift gears and talk about the production design for a second, because this is something that almost never gets discussed but is absolutely wild. The Vought Tower set, which is essentially the corporate headquarters of the entire show's antagonist structure, was designed with deliberate architectural references to real-world buildings associated with American corporate and media power. We are talking about things like the visual language of Trump Tower in New York, the aesthetic of certain Fox News studio spaces, and the broader vocabulary of glass and steel and gold that American wealth uses to signal dominance. Every detail in that set, from the color palette to the proportions of the lobby to the way natural light is managed, was chosen to evoke a specific feeling in viewers on a subconscious level. The idea was that audiences should feel vaguely uncomfortable in that space even when nothing bad is technically happening on screen. Production designer Arv Graywall and his team were essentially using architecture as psychological manipulation, which is, when you think about it, exactly what Vought itself does throughout the show. The set mirrors the company's methods. That level of thematic coherence in production design is genuinely rare. Now here's something about Erin Moriarty, who plays Annie January, also known as Starlight, that I think completely changes how you appreciate her performance. When Moriarty came into the role, she made a very specific decision about Annie's relationship to her own powers. In a lot of superhero stories, the powers are the exciting part, the thing the character is proud of and wants to show off. Moriarty decided that for Annie, the powers are actually a source of deep ambivalence. They're connected to her mother's ambitions for her, to a childhood where she was trained and shaped and molded rather than simply loved. So whenever you see Starlight using her abilities, particularly in the earlier seasons, watch Moriarty's face in the moments right before and right after. There's this flicker of something complicated, something that isn't quite pride or excitement. It's closer to resignation. She's doing what she was made to do, and she's not sure whether that's a good thing. That's an incredibly subtle choice that never gets stated explicitly in the dialogue, but it's there in almost every scene where the powers appear. Speaking of things hidden in plain sight, let's talk about the deep, played by Chase Crawford, and the specific way the show handles his storyline as a commentary on something very real and very dark. When we first meet the Deep, he commits an act of sexual harassment against Starlight in his first substantial scene. The show doesn't gloss over this. It doesn't make him a cartoon villain because of it. Instead, it then proceeds to show us in excruciating detail the way that someone with power can commit harm and then essentially coast through the institutional protection that power provides. The Deep is demoted, sent to a smaller market, publicly embarrassed, but never actually held fully accountable in any meaningful way. He retains his celebrity. He retains his powers. He retains access to the same circles of power that enabled his behavior in the first place. The writers have confirmed that this arc was directly inspired by the patterns that emerged from the Me Too movement's exposure of how power structures protect predators through partial accountability, enough consequence to create the appearance of justice, not enough to actually change anything. All right, now we're going to get into some production facts that are just objectively insane. The show films primarily in Toronto, Canada, which means that the version of America you see in The Boys is actually built from scratch on Canadian soil. The attention to detail required to make Toronto feel like it could be anywhere in the United States is genuinely staggering. We are talking about extensive set dressing, prop work, and location scouting to find the right buildings and streets and spaces. But there's a layer to this that's almost poetically fitting. The Boys is a show about how America presents a carefully constructed image of itself to the world, an image of heroism and freedom and exceptionalism that masks something much uglier underneath. And the version of America in the show is itself a carefully constructed image built in a completely different country. The artificiality of the production location mirrors the artificiality of the world it's depicting. Whether that's intentional or just a happy accident of budget and tax incentives, I genuinely do not know. But it's hard not to find that meaningful. Let's talk about Compound V for a second, because the mythology around it in the show is based on something that might surprise you. The idea of a substance that can confer superhuman abilities, that is addictive, that corporations would kill to control, and that has unpredictable and sometimes devastating effects on people who receive it, draws on a very real historical tradition of pharmaceutical and medical experimentation on vulnerable populations. Kripke and the writers have pointed specifically to the history of unethical medical trials, the use of prisoners, soldiers, and people without full informed consent as test subjects for experimental treatments and drugs. The Nuremberg Code, established after World War II to prevent exactly this kind of abuse, exists because these things actually happened. Compound V is a fictional substance, but the power dynamics around it, the secrecy, the corporate motivation, the exploitation of people who have no real choice, those are pulled directly from documented history. The show is asking you to recognize the real world in its fictional horror, which is what the best satire always does. Now I want to talk about something that almost never comes up in discussions of this show, which is the music supervision. The Boys has an absolutely impeccable soundtrack, and the song choices are never accidental. The show uses a technique where it deliberately selects music that creates ironic contrast with what's happening on screen. You'll hear a warm, nostalgic classic rock track playing over something genuinely horrific, or a cheerful pop song accompanying something morally devastating. This isn't just for shock value. It's designed to replicate the experience of consuming corporate media. Think about it. When you watch a feel-good advertisement for a massive corporation, the music is warm and human and emotional. It's designed to make you associate positive feelings with the brand, regardless of what that corporation might actually be doing. The Boys uses that same trick but inverts your awareness of it. You're hearing the manipulation as it happens and recognizing it, which is the entire point of the show. The music supervision team on this show deserves so much more recognition than they receive. Here's a fact about Jensen Ackles joining the show as Soldier Boy that most people know, but what fewer people know is the specific context of why his casting was so narratively brilliant. Ackles spent 15 years playing Dean Winchester in Supernatural, which was also created by Eric Kripke. So when Ackles shows up in The Boys playing a character who is essentially a corrupted, toxic version of the heroic archetype, a character who represents everything dangerous about old-school American masculine mythology, There's a layer of meta-commentary happening that the audience can feel even if they don't fully articulate it. The man who spent over a decade as television's most beloved monster-fighting hero is now playing the monster. The hero has been revealed as a legacy of violence and ego and entitlement that has been sustained by nostalgia and institutional power rather than actual virtue. Kripke has been pretty coy about how intentional this casting choice was in terms of that meta layer, but it's hard to believe it wasn't at least part of the conversation. Let's switch to something about the show's approach to religion, because this is an area where the writing is actually a lot more sophisticated than it gets credit for. The Boys doesn't simply mock religion. That would be easy and cheap. What it actually does is examine the relationship between genuine faith and institutional power. Many of the show's characters who have sincere religious beliefs, like Annie at the beginning of her arc, are depicted with real empathy. Their faith is shown as authentic and meaningful. What the show skewers is not belief itself, but the way that organized religious institutions and corporate entities co-opt the language and aesthetics of faith to consolidate power and control populations. Vought doesn't hate religion. Vought loves religion because religion is an existing system for generating loyalty and compliance, and Vought is very good at plugging into existing systems. That distinction between faith as a genuine human experience and religion as a corporate tool is one of the most intellectually honest things about a show that is otherwise extremely comfortable being over the top. Now here's something about the stunt work and action choreography that I think deserves way more attention. The show has a philosophy about superhero violence that is directly opposed to most of the genre. In Marvel and DC films, superhero violence is typically presented as spectacular and consequence-free. Cities get destroyed, people get thrown through buildings, and the emotional register is excitement and awe. In The Boys, physical violence is almost always presented as grotesque, chaotic, and deeply human in its horror. When someone gets hurt in this show, it looks and sounds and feels like something terrible has happened to a real person. The action choreography team specifically works to strip away the cinematic glamour that usually surrounds superhero combat. The goal is to make you feel the wrongness of what you're watching rather than the excitement of it. This is why the show's most violent scenes are so hard to look away from even when they're deeply uncomfortable. It's not spectacle. It's something closer to tragedy. Here's a wild behind-the-scenes fact that connects the show to real-world corporate behavior in a way that feels almost too on the nose. During the production of one of the seasons, Amazon, which is of course the streaming platform that produces The Boys, a show that is fundamentally a critique of massive corporate power and the way corporations exploit people, was simultaneously being criticized for its own labor practices and working conditions for warehouse employees. The fact that a show this pointed in its corporate satire is produced by and generates profit for one of the world's most powerful corporations was not lost on Kripke, who has made somewhat joking but also not entirely joking comments about the irony. He's referred to The Boys as being like a band that gets to play the most rebellious punk music possible on the biggest stage in the world, which is either an amazing creative situation or a profound example of exactly the kind of co-optation the show is criticizing. Possibly both simultaneously. Let's talk about the character development pipeline, specifically how the writer's room approaches the evolution of characters across seasons. One of the things that makes The Boys distinctive is that character arcs are not written to be inspirational in the traditional sense. In most television, even dark television, characters generally move toward growth, toward healing, toward some version of being better. The Boys is genuinely committed to the idea that trauma, systemic pressure, and power do not produce better people. They produce people who are broken in different configurations. Characters don't get better in this show. They get different. Sometimes they get worse. Sometimes they make genuine progress only to be dragged back by circumstances. This is psychologically much more realistic than most television's version of character development, and it's also significantly more depressing, which is part of why the show feels so heavy even when it's being darkly funny. Something I want to address that almost never comes up is the show's treatment of its female characters, particularly in how it handles the relationship between femininity and power. Shows like this can fall into the trap of depicting female power as simply masculine power in a female body, women who are strong because they fight and dominate and refuse to be soft. The Boys does something more interesting. Characters like Starlight, Queen Maeve, and even in her warped way Stormfront, wield power in ways that are explicitly connected to their identities as women. The way they're expected to perform femininity for the public, the way their power is always filtered through public perception of their gender, the way they're simultaneously hypervisible and dismissed. The show understands that power looks different when you're a woman in a patriarchal system, not because women are less powerful, but because the system creates entirely different constraints and leverage points. That's a nuanced take that a lot of supposedly progressive shows don't actually achieve. Let's get into some specific scene details that were loaded with meaning most viewers might have missed on first watch. There's a scene in Season 2 where Homelander stands alone on a rooftop and talks to his own reflection in a window. On the surface, it looks like a moment of narcissism, which it is, but it's also something more specific. The writers were drawing on a psychological concept related to object permanence and attachment. Homelander, who was raised in a lab and denied normal human bonding, learned to relate to himself as his primary attachment figure. The reflection isn't just vanity. It's him talking to the only entity that has been consistently present in his life. That's a deeply sad read on what superficially appears to be a menacing and self-absorbed moment, and the show gives you just enough to put it together if you're paying attention, but never explains it for you, which is the right call. Here's something about the show's writer's room that fundamentally shaped what The Boys became as a piece of storytelling. Kripke made a deliberate decision to hire writers from very different backgrounds, not just television writers, but people with roots in journalism, political commentary, comedy, and long-form fiction. The goal was to bring in perspectives that weren't shaped by the conventions of how superhero stories are typically told. When your writer's room includes people who think about power and media and corporate influence professionally, rather than just narratively, the critique in the show gets sharper and more specific. You end up with storylines that feel like they were written by people who actually understand the mechanisms of the things they're criticizing, not just people who understand how to create the feeling of critique for entertainment purposes. Alright, let me hit you with some rapid-fire facts that are individually smaller but collectively paint this picture of just how dense and deliberate this show is. The name Vought International was chosen specifically because of its sound. It has that heavy, slightly military feel that evokes American industrial power. The number 7 in the 7 is a deliberate reference to the Justice League, the classic DC team that has 7 core members, and the show's 7 are essentially designed as dark mirror versions of those archetypes. Homelander is Superman gone wrong. The Deep is Aquaman with the societal awkwardness dialed to maximum. Queen Maeve is Wonder Woman filtered through a story of crushed idealism. These parallels are there to make you uncomfortable in a very specific way, because you grew up loving those characters, and the show is asking you to look at what the real-world version of that kind of power might actually produce. The compound that houses Vaught's most classified experiments was deliberately designed to echo the aesthetic of mid-century American government institutions, specifically the visual language of agencies like the CIA in their early years. The architecture of secrecy, the fluorescent lighting, the beige hallways, the bureaucratic mundanity of evil. The show understands that the most frightening things don't look frightening. They look like offices. Let me also talk for a second about the show's international expansion, because the spin-off content, like Gen V and what's been developed for other markets, represent something genuinely interesting about how the franchise is growing. Rather than simply exporting the American version of corporate superhero satire to other countries, the spin-offs are designed to engage with how the specific dynamics of power, celebrity, and institutional corruption manifest in different cultural contexts. Gen V, which is set in a university context, takes the show's themes and applies them to the specific American anxiety around academic institutions, meritocracy mythology, and the ways that young people are shaped and exploited by systems that claim to be developing their potential. It's the same critique applied to a different institution, which is the right way to expand a franchise that's fundamentally about how institutions work. One more deep dive before we get to the end, and this one is about something that operates almost entirely below the level of conscious recognition for most viewers. The sound design of The Boys is doing a tremendous amount of work in every scene. The way the show mixes ambient corporate sound, the hum of fluorescent lights, the ambient noise of the city, the specific acoustic quality of different spaces, is used to create subliminal feelings of unease or comfort or confinement. The Vought Tower interior sounds different from the street-level world of Butcher and the Boys, and those sonic differences are there to reinforce the class and power distinctions the show is dramatizing. When you're inside the system, it sounds a certain way. When you're outside it, it sounds different. Most viewers will never consciously notice this, but they'll feel it, and that feeling shapes how they interpret everything that happens in those spaces. There's something I want to close on that I think is the most important fact about The Boys that almost nobody talks about, which is that the show is ultimately about the relationship between audiences and the stories they consume. Every time you watch a superhero movie and feel the dopamine hit of the hero winning, of justice being served, of the good guys triumphing, you're participating in a kind of mass cultural experience that The Boys is trying to make you think critically about. Not because there's anything wrong with enjoying those stories, but because those stories shape our expectations of what power should look like and how justice should work. And when those expectations meet the real world, they can leave us confused and unprepared for how messy and ambiguous and institutional actual power is. The show is asking its audience to be smarter consumers of the stories they're told. Not to stop enjoying stories, but to understand that stories always have an agenda, whether that's the explicit propaganda of Vaught's superhero media machine or the subtle agenda of the actual entertainment industry producing the content you watch for relaxation. That's a genuinely challenging and uncomfortable thing to sit with, which is exactly why The Boys keeps you coming back. The fact that a show this intellectually pointed has become one of the most watched programs in streaming history is either a sign that audiences are hungry for this kind of challenge, or it's the most elaborate example of the show's own themes playing out in real time. A piece of revolutionary content being consumed at massive scale, generating profit for a corporation, becoming another piece of the entertainment machine it claims to critique. Maybe both things are true. Maybe that tension is the whole point. Kripke might be the most honest person in the room, making art about the room he's standing in while fully acknowledging that he's standing in it. The Boys isn't just a show about superheroes being terrible. It's a funhouse mirror held up to every system of power we've decided to trust. And if you weren't already watching it with that frame in mind, I hope this video changed that for you. There's so much more to find in every single episode when you know what to look for. If you dug this breakdown, hit that like button and subscribe because I go this deep on shows, films, and stories all the time, and this is genuinely just the tip of the iceberg. Drop in the comments what detail from the show you think most people sleep on. I read all of them and I want to know what you've caught that I might have missed. I'll see you in the next one.